The Primarch knew that law and order, the twin foundations of civilization, are only maintained through fear of punishment. Man is not a peaceful animal. It is a creature of war and strife. To force the beasts into civilization, one must remind them that excruciation awaits those who harm the herd. He wanted us to be the angels of death, and for a time, we were.
A middle-aged man scrambled at Talos' chest plate with dirty fingernails. "Cyrion?" he asked. Before Talos could answer, the man fled, repeating the same whispered question to one of the Astartes 2 rows behind. At no point did the Legion stop marching. Pistol fire broke out as the enforcers in expensive business suits took out one of the mortals in the avenue that strayed far enough from the Astartes to guarantee a kill shot without hitting one of the armored giants. None of the enforcers wished to risk his own death by missing and hitting the revered armor of the Night Haunter's sons. An elderly woman harassed Xarl. She was barely over half his height.
"Where is he?"
she shrieked, wasted hands scratching at the marching warrior's armor.
"Xarl, where is he? Answer me!"
Talos could read the discomfort in his brother's face as Xarl marched on. The old woman, beneath her mop of wild white hair, saw him paying attention. Talos immediately faced forward again, feeling the old woman clawing at his unmoving arm with her weak grip.
"Look at me!"
she pleaded.
"Look at me!"
Talos didn't. He marched on, weeping, wailing after him. The old woman fell behind.
"Look at me! It's you, Talos! Look at me!"
An enforcer's gunshot ended her demands. Talos hated himself for feeling relief. 5 hours later, back aboard Blackened, Xarl had sat next to him on the restraint couches. Never before and never again would Talos see his brother's face marked with such hesitancy.
"That wasn't easy for any of us. But you did well, brother."
What did I do so differently?
Xarl swallowed, something seeming to dawn behind his eyes.
"That woman, the one from the crowd. You didn't recognize her?"
Talos tilted his head, watching Xarl carefully.
I barely saw her.
"She said your name."
Xarl pressed.
"You truly didn't recognize her?"
They were reading our names off our armor scrolls.
Talos narrowed his eyes. Xarl rose to his feet, making to move away. Talos rose with him, gauntlet clamped on his brother's shoulder guard.
"She wasn't reading our names. She knew us, brother. She recognized us, even after 20 years, and the changes wrought by the gene seed. Throne, Talos, you must have recognized her."
I didn't, I swear. I saw only an old woman.
Xarl shrugged off Talos' grip. He didn't turn around. His words echoed with the same finality as the gunshot that silenced the old woman's pleas.
"The old woman. She was your mother."
"One soul, my son. One hunt. In the name of revenge, you will hunt one shining soul when all others turn their back on vengeance. Soul Hunter, prophet of the 8th Legion, favored of Curse, Talos Valcoran. A life that begins in the 30th millennium. Through eyes as black as the sky itself, a child will look out through the window of his tutor's classroom. The dim hab lights and bustling vehicles will forefront to the pitch-black skies, barely seen through the gaps of the towering structures. The rains poured, as did the pollution that choked out the crippling sun that orbited Nostromo. It had been a distant memory, a time of order and stability. where once a king had ruled over a very, very quiet peace. All children knew the tale of how decades ago a night haunter brutalized all of the hive cities into one rule, only for a man, no, a being of light, called the Emperor of Mankind, who would come and take his son, their king, to battle across the stars. The child had read tales like these in the books his mother had given him. He devoured them, understood them, and yet when the tutor's questions came, he was silent. They thought he was slow like the rest of them, but he just knew better. It was all pointless. He was destined to join a gang, just like his father. He was going to die in a brutal way in some dingy alley, just like his father. They all were. Such is the fate on Nostromo. The boy and his friend, well, the son of his mother's friend ran home. The blasting of music, vehicle horns and crude shouts filling the air of perpetual night. The boys caught a glimpse down an alley, seeing a man tower over a crying woman. Her outfit was torn and she looked to the boys for help, only for the boy's friend to drag him away. They saw nothing. That was what they told themselves. In the cramped and filthy quarters the boy's mother made a meal. She was small and fragile, always covering the tattoos that patched up her arms, as if to hide the shame. He knew what they were, markings of property. The academy had contacted her today, she told the boy. Because they think I am slow, he told his mother. Because he was quiet, and because they judged. He was quiet because he didn't understand why he should even try in the first place. Even if he showed them how smart he was, it meant nothing. Even if they got to live in the outskirts of the city instead of here, it changed nothing. It was just as dangerous and broken there. The boy's mother began to cry and held him tight, even as he felt empty and numb. Through tears she told him there was another way, that clever and smart boys were given a chance. They could leave this world entirely. Something stirred within the boy. He could leave. He could venture into the stars. But who would take care of you, he told her. The boy's mother smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes. She told him she would be okay. He could do and be whatever he wanted to be. Heroes can do whatever they want. A hero? The boy giggled. He saw his mother truly smile, even though he didn't understand why. The boy promised his mother he wouldn't be silent anymore. He would show them that he is a clever boy. He would go to the stars and do whatever he wanted. He could be Talos, the hero, but that hero's journey would begin in blood. Talos and his only friend, Xarl, grew. They joined a gang just as their fathers had before them. By the age of 10, they were thieves, running through the damp, dark and claustrophobic labyrinth of the hive cities. By 13, Talos took his first life. He felt the sinking sensation, the buckling and grating as his knife pushed past the shopkeeper's ribs. He saw the look of confusion and pain in his face. He felt his blood splatter upon his own face, the heat of vitality streaking down. He would never forget his first kill, no matter how long he lived. He would feel no guilt or sadness. Nostromo had taken that out of him. He would only remember the shock. All the others he killed, even the dozens his own age, that came later faded into memory before that first time he became a man. It was a miracle in itself that Talos and Xarl had lived to the years of adolescence, but there were rewards that came with showing just how smart they really were. It was just like the stories of generations before. The bright and talented had been elevated into angels. But as the decades passed on Nostromo, the quality of aspirants degraded, as did the world with the Night Haunter gone for so long. The Night Lords, the 8th Legion, the Astartes, superhuman warriors crafted from a mix of chemical stimulants, and vat-grown organs filled with the DNA of a demigod. Shock warriors crafted to be the front line of the ever-growing Imperium of mankind. Talos, Xarl, and thousands of young Nostraman men would be given the chance to ascend, to join the war across the stars, building a new golden era under the guiding light of the Emperor of mankind. With the genetic material of a son of the Emperor, they would become heroes, if he survived the process to come. Talos felt the pain flood every inch of his veins. He feels the raw surgery scars and the two hearts beating in his chest. He has never felt pain like this before. He tries to resist as a giant in a white mask urges him to sleep. His body begins to transform and grow. His muscles and bones are far stronger than a mortal man. His reflexes feel sharp, and he raises his rifle and bolt guns in the training grounds. He spills Nostraman blood, a young man like him, knowing it could have been either of them. He is gifted with knowledge and skills forged over centuries. He is fed indoctrination of the Night Haunter's teachings. After years, Talos stands unclothed before thousands of giants like him. A sea of porcelain scar skin and black eyes stare upon their masters. The concepts of being a man is forgotten. They are more, unrestrained by lesser human desires and feeble hang-ups. His memories of the brutal life on Nostromo feels like a distant memory, like a dream whose details are obscured from him. He even forgets his mother's face. He was sure he had one at least, but a weapon doesn't need a mother. He is gifted with armor and arms forged on Mars. His helmet is stained with the apothecary's white. He is Talos of First Claw, 10th Company, scion of the 8th Legion and son of the Night Haunter, the Primarch Conrad Kurz. He will scour the universe of the non-compliant and Xenos, and he will bring fear to the hearts of men across thousands of worlds. Fire and blood. An endless cycle as he and the 8th Legion were deployed across the growing Imperium of Man. Thousands of Astarte corpses, and even some who still drew ragged breath, fell under the care of the apothecary Talos. At times he would save the weapons, the resources that was the Astartes, but most were the extraction of the precious gene seed from their corpses, to be sealed away and reused for the next generation of Astartes. The additional medical training Talos received did nothing to bond him closer to his so-called brothers. Some were the very scum he had fought in the damp alleys of Nostromo. He knew what they had done, and they knew what he had done. Beneath Sergeant Vandred, a man whose abilities in void warfare was almost unmatched in the Legion, 10th Company battled across stars, accompanied by Cyrion, Reuven, Xarl, and Sarzel, all led by Malcharion, the War Sage. Captain of the company and the confidant of the demigod, Talos finally caught a glimpse of Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. It was the living myth standing before him, the nightmare his mother and all others had told to their children. The Night Haunter who had crippled Nostromo, placing a fear so silent and absolute the world had once felt peace. For Talos to look upon his Primarch, his heart began to pulse faster. How could the Emperor's words be so false? That he was Astartes, and he would know no fear. But standing before Kurz made him feel the closest thing to dread. The ghost white, ghoulish king towered above him. Disheveled locks cropped a face that was nightmare itself. From two midnight black pools the demigod looked out to the world in an expression of hate and madness. And yet there was a nobility. A dark king who seemed to stand for something beyond himself. Fate was written to the Primarch, assailed by the visions of the future. In midnight clad the Primarch stood, his very armor and lightning claws, crafted to imprint a distinct image upon the human mind. Dread. It was strange, thought Talos. He had never had a father before. Justice is our purpose, the only route to total justice is fear. Without fear, there can be no order. The few will suffer now to feed that fear, so that many others will live. Mankind were beasts, Curse told his sons. Animals that had to be corralled and made to fall in line. Fear was the only tool that brought past Nostromo to heal, and it was the only way to secure the Imperium of mankind. In midnight clad, Talos and his brothers would drape icons. They would cast visages that paralyzed the human psyche. Worlds in defiance of compliance or in rebellion would assemble to the field. The noise, the fanfare, the bravado beating in their chests, as they prepared to push back the tyrant Imperium. From the skies the enemy force would arrive, but the gun lines would remain silent. The weeks would pass. Nothing. No changes. Only the enthusiasm failing away. And then the screams came. Through picked feeds and vox casts, hundreds of voices screamed out in a soul-crying pain. People of importance, world governor families, politicians and generals were taken, their deaths carried out by Talos and his brothers. In such a painstakingly slow process, the victim went beyond the point of begging for death. Worlds whose enthusiasm and defiance had rallied them to fight found that very hope murdered as they witnessed the fate awaiting them at the hands of these Night Lords. Compliance always came quickly, without a shot even being fired. In battles where worlds would have burned, millions either dead or starving, only a few hundred had to die, and the peace that reigned after was cold and obedient. This was the Night Haunter's justice. A sacrifice of the few for the many, but what began as a gruesome work for peace permeated a corruption in the sons of Curse. Talos at first hated to admit it, but what company would even judge him? As he butchered men, women, and even the young, he began to enjoy it. The power, the righteousness, the spilling of vitae in the name of a just universe. He was, in a way, a hero. And yet for this sacrifice the 8th Legion was condemned. Talos saw the look in their brother Legion's eyes. From the Imperial Fist to the Salamanders they wore expressions of shock and disgust, as the Night Lords massacred populations. It was hypocritical, wasn't it? The untold death and destruction wreaked by the other Primarchs and Legions. And yet they shy away when so few die for the many. After decades of battle, the open truth of the Legion's nature was undeniable. The justice of the Night Haunter's methods had been taken too far. Too much zeal, and not born of sacrifice, but degeneracy. The quality of Nostroman recruit in the absence of the Night Haunter's rule had deteriorated as well on their homeworld. Would Talos and Xarl have even been accepted into the generations before? And what did it say that even they were disgusted by the character of some of their brothers? Talos, Xarl, and First Claw marched through the dim streets of Nostromo, a victory parade, to appease the masses in the absence of the Night Haunter. Talos wondered why they cheered, as if these rotten people even cared for the Imperium, and what the Legion's victories meant. In the absence of their lost Primarch ruler, the populace hoped for the Haunter's sons to return and take up his duties. The Primarch's lessons were being unlearned. Through each generation, the imprint of his silent crusade on society was a thing of the past. Talos had lived here himself, barely believing the world had once been a bastion of control and order under a Gene God's rule. Now it became humbling, to feel the weight of terrible expectation willed from the crowd. To know they were destined for crushing disappointment. The cheers turned as they began to scream out names. Feeble men and women rushed forward, desperate, trying to find the names they spoke aloud. They were fathers, they were mothers, crying out for their children. The boys they had sacrificed in the name of an empire that had forgotten them. How the visages of these hulking, deformed giants must have terrified them. The first gunshots came from the enforcers as the Night Lords continued to march. "Where is he?" Talos heard an elderly woman shriek. He turned to a feeble woman clawing at his brother's armor, Xarl's face looking uncomfortable. Talos looked at her and felt nothing. No recognition. The old woman, beneath her mop of wild white hair, saw him paying attention. Talos immediately faced forward again, but feeling the old woman clawing at his unmoving arm with her weak grip. "Look at me," she pleaded. "Look at me." Talos didn't. He marched on, weeping. Wailing after him, the old woman fell behind. "Look at me. It's you, Talos. Look at me." An enforcer's gunshot ended her demands. It was quiet back aboard their ship. That look of discomfort never left Xarl's face until he finally spoke up. "You didn't recognize her? Truly?" Talos felt himself hesitate. Was he supposed to? She was just an old crone, whose death finally ended that annoyance. But Xarl held his gaze. She recognized us. Even after 20 years and the changes wrought by the gene seed, the old woman, Xarl said slowly. "She was your mother." Talos wasn't sure what he was meant to feel. Grief, maybe. But it was just like that night when he plunged his dagger into the shopkeeper. He only felt shock, because he was a man who didn't recognize his own mother's face. There had been a memory once, of a feeble woman who told him he could be a hero, a woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life, a mother he hated to see cry. But the elevation into Astartes had taken that from him. It was a curse to be a god's son. It would only be a few short years from the parade to the dull streets of Nostromo that again the Legion would return to their homeworld. From the skies the entire Night Lord's Legion fleet sat. From his throne their Primarch, the Dark King Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter gave his declaration. Nostromo was a sickness. Its people were rotten and broken, and in his absence they had descended back into their old ways. The recruits of the last decades were a poison to the teachings of justice, the fear the Night Haunter had tried to impart. They killed, tortured, and brutalized because they enjoyed it. Perhaps if he expunged the source, the corruption would cease spreading. Talos and First Claw looked from the viewports. Bleak and near lightless Nostromo turned in the cold vacuum of space. Over the Vox stations the orders were blared out, full battery lasers to fire into their homeworld. Talos heard the silence, and then confusion, and then the resistance. Cries from the mortal staff, and some defiance of the Nostraman-born Astartes. From ship to ship the first Captain Sevatar silenced the weaklings. The scarlet beams rode across the void, into the very chasms the Night Haunter had landed in centuries before. Nostromo began to burn before Talos' eyes, and then it cracked apart. The home he had once known, the streets he had barely survived, the billions of people living their lives were erased within an instant. And it was justice, so said Kurz, spoken from a face that was evidently racked by growing insanity and pain. At times, in raptures of pain, I saw what was to occur laid out before me. In these waking dreams, I took countless lives with my bare hands, heads taken as trophies. I died again and again at the hands of my father. My sons butchered and maimed their brothers. My name was to become synonymous with dread, but most vividly and most frequently, I saw my world pierced by a lance of purest light, splittering it, shattering it into dust. Perhaps a part of Talos was glad to see it gone. Perhaps Talos truly believed in the justification of his Primarch. Perhaps he felt nothing at all. Within moments of Nostromo's death, fleets rocketed into proximity. Horus, Vulcan, Dawn, and others arrived. Their censure had begun. The 8th Legion were disciplined for their barbaric act, and for their battle tactics. How many worlds had they done exactly the same to, and the Imperium hadn't even blinked? Why the scrutiny now, when they had brought thousands of worlds into compliance? The Imperium knew how they achieved this, and had said nothing for centuries. The hypocrisy. In the wake of Nostramo's death, Talos felt something change within him. It began in his dreams, imagery and emotions, and then it all became clearer as his body suddenly convulsed uncontrollably. Just like his father, Talos began to see the future. Fragments. Himself and his brothers out of time. He foresaw the very fate the increasingly maddening Night Haunter would whisper about in his psychotic frenzies. He saw his father's death, and he saw a war. The galaxy burning as brother fought brother, the Imperium ripping itself apart as the Emperor's most beloved son, the War Master Horus, led a great host to Terra, and a storm in flesh, with a rain of blades, she who stalks the void, the storm of silence, and Eldar. Death to the false Emperor. The rally cry roared from the first Captain Sevatar, as dream became reality. Just as Kurz, Talos and the Eighth knew, the War Master Horus had come to them, speaking of the tyrant Emperor, a liar who seeks to build an empire that will one day worship him as a god. He lies about the warp, the entities and true power that lie within, so he can keep it for himself. He has turned his back on the very methods you have burdened yourself with to build an Imperium that will erase you from its history, Horus said. The anger and hate was palpable. Talos felt it as he and First Claw stared across the retreating salamanders on the world of Isfahan V. The betrayal of Horus and 4 legions had been answered by 8 of the Imperium's own, a retribution for the Isfahan III atrocities. Salamanders, Raven Guard and Iron Hands had clashed against Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children and World Eaters. The Loyalist Legion hailed their allies in the second wave, only to be met with silence. Talos raised his bolter and fired. He cut down men he had once healed as an apothecary, and the Horus heresy had truly begun. From Istvan to years battling against the Dark Angels within the Thramas Crusade, to the capture of Kurz and the scattering of the Legion, Talos and First Claw followed Captain Malcharian, all the way to the walls of Terra itself. Talos wasn't sure where it truly begun, the degeneration of the Legion. He was surrounded by thieves and murderers made into superhuman weapons. In fact, he was just like them. But with the onset of the heresy, a new form of corruption had begun to seep its way in. Chaos. Cyrion had begun to scent human fear, a fact that brought disgust from his brothers. Riven had begun to speak of a pantheon. Even Sergeant Vandred was seeming to twist, as if something lived within his body. Terra burned in the greatest siege humanity had ever witnessed, but then it all began to fall apart. 3 champions, 1 of the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists and White Scars fell in incredibly vicious duels with Captain Malcharian, only for the injuries of the legendary War Sage to be too much. The man begging for death as they interned his body within a dreadnought sarcophagus. And then the news came. Horus had been slain, and the traitors scattered. First Claw under Vandred fled like all the rest of the traitor elements, as the Loyalists hunted them across the galaxy. It was years of pillaging and vengeance as the scattered elements of the Eighth raided Imperial territory. But the vision came to Talos. A gathering of Kurz's sons on the barren waste planet, Tsagulsa. They came to their father. Their dark forms were fuzzy, with hard edges highlighted by the bloody glow of their helm lenses, the flashes of discharge earthing itself through their battle plate. The lightning painted on their armor blinked under this brief illumination, confusing their shape further. Symbols covered other panels. Most had Death's head painted over their faceplates, and the skulls of their victims knocked hollowly together on chains hanging from their shoulders. Kurz was clearly insane, tortured by conflicting drives and a monstrous sense of injustice. But these warriors were not mad. They followed their lord's despicable example freely. Talos and First Claw kneeled before their Primarch, showing their loyalty and pain, as they questioned why he did not join them at the siege of Terra. A wry smile crept over that monstrous face briefly, as the Primarch saw his sons. This was all ordained, he told them. Fate was fixed, and that soon he would join the dead. Talos looked away in anger, as if this had to happen this way. He protested that time may tell a different story, only to be silenced by his Primarch. The call was rung out across the stars. Soon the sons would return to the father, and then Kurz would be vindicated. The Emperor's monster whose fate was fixed was going to die. In a fortress of charcoal stone, the strands of the 8th Legion finally connected. Standing before their Primarch, they tried one last time. The captains and close council of Kurz told him they needed him in the crusade of vengeance to come, but this wasn't about vengeance or righteousness. Talos spoke, not realizing it was his own voice. The others looked to him as his Primarchs affixed him with his haunting gaze. Kurz could see the dawning of realization in his eyes and bade him to speak. This is a lesson from a son to his father. Just as you instruct us in the principles to continue the crusade, you will show your own father, who watches from the golden throne, that you will die for your beliefs. Your sacrifice will echo in your father's heart forever. You believe your martyrdom will set a fiercer example than your life, because death is nothing compared to vindication. Kurz held Talos' helm in his hands, his face contorted and his mouth drooling. How it pained Talos to see his father like this. He was angry. Angry that his father was giving in to this martyrdom when they needed him most. Why? Why do you call me Soul Hunter? He said, the emotion dripping in his voice. One soul, my son. One hunt. In the name of revenge, you will hunt one shining soul when all others turn their back on vengeance. Shen. The assassin even Talos had seen in his dreams was coming. She would enter unimpeded and be allowed to take the life that was fated. It was the last orders of their gene father, and they would not intervene or seek vengeance. But Kurz told Talos that of all his sons, he alone would defy him. And he alone told Talos that he cared nothing for what the Legion would do after his death. The night had come, as the Legion sat with bated breath. Talos couldn't believe it, that he would defy his father's last wish. He had not foreseen this. The assassin ship entered the system and made planetfall. Yet the Legion still did nothing, for none would defy his will. A mad king, a son of the Emperor, sat upon a throne as Talos and the others stood outside. The anger began to burn in Talos. He loved his father, his gene sire, and yet a part of him hated what he had become. In this universe of cruelty and pain, what else did he have but a father and a brotherhood? And yet it was clear to Talos he barely had any of these things, with a father who hated his sons, and brothers who were the scum of humanity. The throne room doors opened. Talos looked upon Shen, and all his sense died, and grief and fury roared in his blood. Dripping a demigod's blood onto the deck, Shen held the severed head of Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. Talos screamed her name through his vox grill and broke into a sprint, revving his chainsword, as like fate had promised, he broke his father's last wish. The Imperial assassin and Soul Hunter rocketed through the oily black halls of this impossible fortress, Voxcore screaming into Talos' ears for him to stop. This was their father's last wish. The assassin must get back to Terra. Vandred and Cyrion pleaded with him, but it all fell on deaf ears. As the assassin reached her ship, the Vox again bloomed with chatter. "She has stolen his relics. Our father did not see this. Kill her." Of course, Talos thought. All they cared for was the pieces they could use to rule in the power vacuum. Their ambition was sickening. To the assassin's ship Talos chased, as fire and munitions suddenly came raining down upon the 8th. The Eldar were attacking. Xenos. Why now? Talos ignored it, pounding over the dust into the assassin's ship. The bodies of Eldari and Night Lords piled up in the corridors, the failure of those who had tried to follow. Shen stood in the blood of Superhuman and Xenos. Finally, she was in the clear. Swallowed by the darkness of the room, she began to relax. Talos closed his hand around her throat. He could sense she was duller, slower, and the beat of her heart was quicker than it had been in the palace. The assassin was weakened from her escape in the recent battle, but she would kill him before his heart had the time to beat twice if he tried to hold her. Everything about this creature was engineered to end life, and with infinitely more skill and grace than the blunt efficiency of Astartes. He was a warrior, but she was a murderer. He was trained for battle and war, but she was bred only to kill. The same second his hand had gripped her throat, she was already acting. Talos didn't squeeze. Her armor of precious sin skin would resist such trauma. He jerked her close, risking a headbutt to daze her. That was a mistake. The assassin leaned her head back like a recoiling serpent. Curse her, she was fast. Talos felt her fitted hand coming up to unleash the lethality within her rings, each one a digital weapon of some unknown configuration. He wasted no time. The Night Lord spat into her face and hurled her away. She had not screamed in many years. It wasn't that the pain was new to her, nor even a surprise, but this was no neat severance of limb from body. This was the dissolving of her eyes in her skull. And never before had pain eclipsed her senses so completely. Even through the agony, she imagined the wretched Night Lord stumbling away in his cumbersome armor, amused at her momentary helplessness, and she was right. In the darkness, Talos relished the sound of her scream. Even sweeter was the subtle, mellifluous hiss of acidic venom eating into the soft tissue of her beautiful blue eyes. Panting now, seeing nothing but milky white sunfire, the assassin swallowed the pain, remembered her teachings, and used the agony as a focus. He cast a black-eyed glance at the assassin, blindly fighting the air, her lashing kicks and blaze sweeps utterly lethal, aimed at audible joints and the weak points of his armor, but utterly useless. Talos was already across the bridge away from her, Bolter still barking. Deafened and disorientated, the assassin slowed her movement. Desperately poised, muscle taut, she seemed to be trying to filter the noise of his armor through the banging detonations. Talos spoke a single word. Prey sight. As the blur of dull thermal movements came charging toward him, as every bolt he fired was dodged with ease, Talos filled his 3 lungs with the blood-rich air of this wrecked bridge. As deep and echoing as the first thunderclap of a breaking storm, he roared his hatred at her. Within the Calidus assassin, training an instinct met in honed, focused fusion. That fusion split within Shen, as she lost the second of her senses. The depriving assault hit her as hard and as fast as the first. A moment of ear-splitting pain lanced through the core of her mind, shaking her hearing, and all was suddenly silent. She had no idea if the Night Lord was still screaming, or had fallen quiet after detecting his triumph. Her senses were killed. She only felt the air shaking around her as her enemy moved again. As the bolts slashed past, blinded, deafened, she twisted in her sprint and leapt at where she was certain the Astartes must be. Her estimation was, as always, perfect. But Talos held her, embracing her with the gentleness of a lover. "My father told me of this night," he whispered to her, "and I never believed him. I never believed I would disobey him until you came into our house and took him from us." Shem never heard his words. The assassin dropped her blade. As her gloved fingers uncurled almost against her will, she felt the heavy weapon thump against her boot. Strengthless arms wouldn't move. The Night Lord's chain sword yet impaled her on his blade. She'll be dead within moments. "Godslayer," she said to him, never hearing her own words. "That is how I will be remembered." Talos blinked stinging tears from his eyes. His thumb edged closer to the chainsaw's activation rune. Threat, threat, threat. The warning runes flickered. Talos clicked them away, clearing his red visor vision display of all but the assassin's masked face and her hollow, bleeding eye sockets. "Ave Dominus Nox," he whispered, and gunned the impaling chainsword into life. He drifted for 16 hours, alone in one of the boarding pods left by the ravaged survivors of First Company. In the absolute silence, he had only his grief and satisfaction to pass the time. His father was dead. His legion was broken as the ambitious captains fought over the scraps. The Imperium was coming to scour the traitors from the material universe. A new vision washed over Talos. A future millennia in the making. A grim dark universe of only war.
"You speak of disunity. Your legion lacks a figurehead."
Many claim to be the Night Haunter's heir. The Talon Master has vanished, but his claim was no stronger than any other. Too many other leaders have similar items once carried by our father. Captain Acerbus leads the largest coalition of companies. But again, his insistence reeks of desperation and need. No true claimant has come forth, as you did with your legion. Our father's throne sits empty.
Again, I hear the disquiet in your words.
I am not hiding it, War Master.
Admirable. So tell me, does your heart not cry out to take that throne yourself?
Talos froze. He hadn't expected this. He suspected the War Master would seek to use his curse in some way, perhaps even drawing him into the ranks of the Black Legion as a pet advisor. But this was new, and, he suspected, it was a bluff designed to throw off his thoughts into disparity.
No.
You hesitated.
You asked a difficult question.
Abaddon walked closer to Talos, his boots crushing debris beneath each thundering tread. The helms and human skulls impaled upon the trophy rack rattled together, birthing a clanking melody like some barbarous musical instrument. Threat. The rune flickered, and the Night Lord looked through his red vision at the War Master, no more than 10 meters distant. He couldn't help but compare him to the original bearer of the title, Horus, beloved son of the Emperor, Lord of the 18 Legions. Talos had only seen the first War Master once, but it was a moment of devastating potency in the storm of his memory.
I saw the first War Master once,
he voiced aloud, without meaning to. Abaddon chuckled, a series of throaty, predatory grunts.
Where?
Daromar. We fought alongside the Lunar Wolves in the capital city.
The Lunar Wolves?
Abaddon openly sneered at the use of his legion's first name, before they become the Sons of Horus, in honor of their Primarch, and long before they become the Black Legion to expunge the shame of their father's failure.
Days of blindness and war, based upon the darkest of lies.
True, but they were days of unity,
Talos said, recalling the majesty of Horus at the head of his legion, his armor of grey-white, polished to a finish of ivory and pearl. He was human, but more. Astartes, but more. Contained within the first Primarch was all that was great and glorious within humanity, distilled to perfection by the flesh myths and gene weavers of the Emperor's hidden fortress. To stand within his sight was to bathe in light, to be flooded by inspiration more vital and real than the singing chemicals pumping through Astarte's blood. His eye-aching brilliance, Horus drew everything to him, merely by taking the field. He ensured he was the fulcrum upon which everything spun. He became the heart of the battle, a maelstrom of slaughter, untouched by the mud and the blood of the battlefield, even as he reaped the lives of the foe. And Talos had barely seen him. He formed his opinion of the living god from the other side of a cityscape battleground, seeing little more than the juddering images allowed by his helmet-zoomed vision. As he sought to assess the lunar wall's front line, it had been like glancing at a moving painting of an ancient hero. He looked to Abaddon. How times change.
What do you recall of War Master Horus?
My eyes hurt in his presence, even from a distance. I am Nostramo born,
he added, knowing that would explain everything.
You Night Lords, so literal.
The thought seemed to entertain him, which struck Talos as petty beyond belief. Clarity came upon him in that moment. Abaddon was an avatar for what the traitor legions had become. Talos watched him now, knowing neither of them were the equal of their Primarch progenitors. None of the legions could make that claim. They were all mere shadows of their fathers, and their fathers had failed. The thought was a humbling one, and the weak claws of melancholy reached for his conscious mind again. These encroaching thoughts he dismissed with a scowl, refocusing his attention by acquiring target locks on the weak points of Abaddon's armor plating. Precious few existed, but he felt his armor's machine spirit responding, awakening again, teased back into anger. It helped him focus.
You have still not stated your reasons for summoning me, War Master.
I will be blunt, then. After all, we have a crusade to forge in the coming days. Tell me, Prophet, have you seen anything of the Crythe war in your recent visions?
No,
lied Talos immediately.
No?
The War Master narrowed his eyes.
I have seen nothing that will help you plan. Nothing that will bring you new information or aid you in any way.
But you have seen something.
Nothing you have any right to know.
The claws chimed quietly as they clanged together, Abaddon closing and opening his gauntlet just once.
I am not famous for my patience,
he said slowly, his voice ripe with threat.
But it is enough that my suspicions are confirmed. You are a seer, and you have seen what will come.
You seem to care a great deal about my visions. I thought you had sorcerers of your own.
A streak of amused pride colored his words. Abaddon didn't seem to notice, or to care if he did.
They are having difficulty piercing the warp's veil. You, evidently, have done what they cannot. You have witnessed the future. It should not surprise you that a commander would wish dearly for such information. Talos, my brother, I have an offer for you.
I refuse. I thank you for the honor of whatever this offer might have been, but my answer is no.
Why so blatant a refusal?
Abaddon scowled now, the first time he had, and the grimace revealed filthy, blackened teeth behind his bluish lips.
If you are offering me the chance to lead the 8th Legion, I refuse because it is an impossible task, and not one within your power to grant. If you are asking me to leave my Legion, I refuse because I have no interest in doing so.
You reject my offer without hearing it.
Your offer will not be in my interests. There is little of any Legion in what remains to us, War Master. I no longer believe we will be the death of the Imperium. I no longer believe we are true to our fathers. Corruption has its claws deep within many of us.
Then why do you still fight?
Abaddon's glower remained. His teeth clench and his eyes roar in their open glare.
Because I have nothing else. I was born to fight, and forged in the fires of war. I am Astartes. I fight because it is right that we fight. The Emperor abandoned the Great Crusade and demanded humanity pave the way for his ascension to godhood. I don't expect to topple him from the Golden Throne, but such hubris, such evil must always be opposed.
And what of Curse?
Talos stepped closer, his muscles bunched.
You will not speak his name with such disrespect, Abaddon.
You think you intimidate me, worm?
I think I address your Primarch by his title as the First Warmaster, despite his ultimate failure. You will do the same honor for the Lord of my Legion, who was vindicated even in death.
Then tell me, what of the Night Haunter? Does his murder mean nothing to you?
The Emperor betrayed my Gene Father. Even without the Great Heresy's ideals, the need for vengeance alone would be enough for me to live my life only to see the Imperium fall. But you are right.
At this, Abaddon nodded again.
I respect the Night Lords as brothers, but you are right. You are a broken legion.
And you are not?
The War Master turned, his voice dropping to a threatening murmur.
What did you say?
Threat, threat, threat. The rune flickered.
Do you fight, War Master, because you believe you can still win? After centuries of defeat, after failed Black Crusades, after infighting and war has bled your legion dry and draped you in ignominy among the other legions, is it not true your men are slave to demons to make up for the great losses you have sustained since the death of your Primarch? You leech strength from other sources because your own legion's might is almost gone.
Silence answered his proclamation.
This meeting is a facet of that. You wonder about how my power will benefit your failing armies.
Abaddon might have laughed. It would have been an act of a great leader to laugh, to humor a lesser warrior, to bring him around to his own way of thinking through persuasion and empathy, even if it were all false. But Abaddon was not such a leader. He was shrewd enough, at least, to guess Talos would never be fooled. The Storm Bolter barked once. The sins of the father, they say. Maybe, maybe not. But we were always different. My brothers and I, we were never truly kin with the others. The angels, the wolves, the ravens. Perhaps our difference was our father's sin. Perhaps it was his triumph. I am not empowered by anyone to cast a critical eye over the history of the 8th Legion. These words stick with me, though. The sins of the father. These words have shaped my life. The sins of my father echo throughout eternity as heresy. Yet the sins of my father's father are worshipped as the first acts of godhood. I do not ask myself if this is fair. Nothing is fair. The word is a myth. I do not care what is fair, and what is right, and what's unfair and wrong. These concepts do not exist outside the skull of those who waste their life in contemplation. I ask myself night after night if I deserve vengeance. I devote each beat of my heart to tearing down everything I once raised. Remember this, remember it always. My blade and bolter help forge the Imperium. I and those like me, we hold greater right than any to destroy mankind's sickened empire. For it was our blood, our bones and our sweat that built it. Look to your shining champions now, the Adeptus Astartes that scour the dark places of your galaxy. The hordes of fragile mortals enslaved to the Imperial Guard, and shackled in service to the throne of lies. Not a soul among them was even born when my brothers and I built this empire. Do I deserve vengeance? Let me tell you something about vengeance. My brothers and I swore to our dying father that we would atone for the great sins of the past. We would bleed the unworthy empire that we had built, and cleanse the stars of the false emperor's taint. This is not mere vengeance. This is redemption. My right to destroy is greater than your right to live. Remember that when we come for you. Talos stands before the War Master Abaddon. It has been over 10,000 years in the material universe. 10,000 years since Talos, First Claw, and many of the Night Lord warbands had retreated into the Eye of Terra, in a realm where the laws of physics didn't apply, and where time was in flux. To Talos it has been mere centuries, since the war that took him to Terra, but since that night his father had died, and he had cradled his severed head in his arms, everything was breaking or broken. First Claw had lost Xarl in the evacuation from Tsagulsa, as the Imperial forces had come for revenge. Xarl's chain axe, now inherited by Uzas of Third Claw, whose joining was met with disdain. Their sorcerer Reuven had abandoned them after First Claw escaped to Vandred's ship, the Covenant. Seemingly dissatisfied with the meaningless raiding nomadic lifestyle the Eighth was forced to live with. Even Vandred, a man he had once respected, had been swallowed by corruption. The Exalted, the creature called itself. In Terminator plate literally twisted and moulded by the taint of the warp. The very presence of it grated on Talos. It was that twisted monster whose very alliance with the despoiler Abaddon had put him before the War Master. In his own suit of Terminator war plate, the War Master dwarfed his men and the Atramentar alike, and the consummately crafted black ceramite he wore was beckoned with ornate finery, emblazoned with brass and bronze edges, and bearing the glaring, slitted, fire-orange eye of Horus at the center of his chestplate. A cloak of grey-white fur, the hide of some huge wolf beast, was draped across his massive shoulders. As with his elite warriors, his back sported spear-like trophy racks, each of them impaling a clutch of Astartes' helms. Several of them were at an angle to stare lifelessly at Talos, their dead gaze an unsuitable reminder of the millions of lives lost to the War Master's machinations in 10,000 years of rebellion and heresy. Abaddon's right hand ended in a vicious power claw of archaic, unique design, the bladed talons, as long as an Astartes arm, curved and glinted in the half-light of the flickering wall lamps. Horus, favoured son of the Emperor, had worn that gauntlet in the Great Crusade and the heresy that followed. He'd used it to slay the angel Sanguinius and wound the Emperor unto the edge of death. Now the dread weapon graced the fist of his gene son, the leader of his fallen legion. That weapon alone almost brought the urge to kneel, to show respect to the one who had carried the blades of ultimate heresy. But it was the War Master's face that drew Talos' attention above all else. Abaddon would never be considered handsome, and the regal lethality emanating from him was nothing a human could project. His face was lined and scarred from centuries of battle, the marks across his pale skin speaking of thousands of battles upon thousands of worlds. His head was shaven but for a top knot of his blue-black hair. In his eyes Talos saw the death of the galaxy. They burned with an inner light, made bright by the dreams of conquest that infested his every waking moment, yet tinged with desperate fury. A longing to inflict vengeance upon the heart of the Imperium. Like chaos itself, Abaddon was a clash of contradictions, and Talos hated his warm, welcoming smile. He could almost smell the corruption beneath the man's skin, a rank scent of charred metal and polluted flesh that teased the edges of Talos' senses. Just like themselves, the War Master was a poor imitation of that time of legend. Abaddon wanted him. The value of the 8th Legion's so-called Soul Hunter, the Prophet. The 8th Legion was broken, and in this war of vengeance only he, the despoiler, could take the battle to Terra. But Talos refused, and against his own better judgment, he implied he and his Black Legion were just as broken and weak. 2 bolter shots fired, and Talos fell to the ground, his consciousness fading. In the weeks prior to this meeting, prior to this war of Crythe, the vision had come to Talos, as First Claw were cutting down thin-blooded Blood Angel scouts. Aurum, the relic Blood Angel sword Talos had acquired in the years since the heresy, had often drawn fools seeking to reclaim the chapter's relic. But something went wrong. Talos fell to the ground. The convulsions were painful. His body spasmed as Cyrion carried him away. The Exalted. Marines and crew of the Covenant listened to the Prophet's howls and mad ramblings in reverence over the Vox. Crythe, Talos told the Exalted. Abaddon's war would call them to the world of Crythe. Returning to his own quarters, Talos strode down the near-lightless corridors of the Covenant of Blood. Perfectly adapted to Nostraman eyes, humans made places their own, decorated and customized, but Nastartes was a weapon. Their mark was so easily extinguished when they too left this life, as Talos entered his barren quarters. 91 hours, Talos had raved, lost in his vision. They were getting worse. A slave stepped forward. Septimus, a grimy middle-aged man, the 7th in the line of personal slaves Talos had owned. Some were murdered, some had even died of old age, some had fallen by corruption. Cyrion stepped into the door's frame. Even now, after years of service, the presence of the legionaries spiked Septimus's fear. A rare, mirthless smile crept across Talos' face, enjoying the fear they inflicted upon the mortal. He told his brother he had seen another vision, another location they must visit before Crythe, and they were going home. They needed to go to Nostromo. A meteor drifted under the light of a cold and distant star. Eurydice, a navigator of House Mervillion of Terra, looked to the sky as the rogue trader ship she travelled with exploded in orbit. Something was coming. She hid in the dark, watching a mortal man with scruffy clothes and black hair walk by. And then the monster, a myth of this age, an Adeptus Astartes in midnight blue plate, with lightning streaks across it. It was draped in chains and skulls. She took the crowbar in her hand and lashed out, only to be snatched and throttled by the superhuman. She unveiled her navigator's third eye upon her forehead. To look within was to drink of the very same madness of the warp. But the Astartes was unaffected. No. Behind the helm, he had closed his eyes. How did he know? How could he have foreseen? I am Talos, the monster spoke, and you are coming with me. A horde of servitors and a navigator, now named Octavia, the 8th slave, a prize from the visions of the Prophet of the 8th, but yet another move that cemented the resentment of the Exalted. And Talos knew it, how the Exalted hated how valuable he was, and the influence he was unwillingly wielding within the warband. Even the Atramentar, the elite terminators of First Company, respected the Soul Hunter, and it made Talos feel good to upset the creature that had once been Vandred. To the space above Crythe, the Covenant finally drifted. Amongst the vessels of other traitor legions it nestled. In the center floated the Vengeful Spirit, flagship of the War Master Abaddon, a place where 2 Primarchs had died, and where the Emperor of Mankind was crippled. A wicked display in this 40th millennium, where living myths sailed the stars. The Imperial fleet arrayed against them held the line, as in the disquieting vacuum of space, munitions roared across the miles of emptiness. Even in the life he was known by Vandred, the Exalted was praised for his genius in void warfare. A statement put to the test as the Covenant of Blood roared in front of the traitor line. It was suicide. A ramming attack vector that would kill the enemy and the Covenant. Only mere miles away the Covenant pivoted hard. A barrage of all its guns and that of the Armada slammed into the pride of the Emperor, a relic of the Heresy's age. The maneuver had definitely killed many of the mortal crew, but from the pride of the Emperor the Exalted saw the ripples of the Imperial shields fail. The drop pods were launched. Talos felt the violent rumble. Xarl and Cyrion always took it in silent stoicism. As Uzas screamed over the Vox, skulls for the Skull Throne. With the dragon's roar, the boarding torpedo bit through the hull of the Imperial vessel. First Claw was in. They were at the bridge door. The terrified Imperials could hear the monsters knocking, as a blade of gold began to pierce through its reinforcements. For the Emperor, the terrified humans screamed, only for another voice to speak back at them. Prey sight. A primal roar, a reptilian-like scream pushed from 3 lungs, and amplified from an Astartes Vox pulsed through the Imperials. Ears bled, and all writhed in agony as Talos, Xarl, Cyrion and Uzas strode through the smoke of the chamber's door. The Admiral was the last to fall, praying to his God Emperor. God Emperor, Talos spat. He had seen the Emperor a few times. Perhaps he was not a man, but he was no god. First Claw were darting their way back to the boarding vessels. Uzas seemed to be more coherent. Perhaps his bloodlust had been sated as he snarled, what should they do? The War Master's fleet was picking the ship apart like carrions to a corpse. The ship was breaking with them in it. Xarl grabbed a human attempting to flee past. The man's uniform looked like every other, white and generic. He lifted the struggling man off the ground by his greasy hair, holding the officer's yelling face closer to his blood-stained faceplate. Through the Vox speakers in his helm's snarling mouth grill, Xarl's voice came out at an insane volume. Tell me where you are stationed. Is it gunnery deck? The officer, quite deaf now, hurriedly drew his pistol in shaking hands and fired it point blank into Xarl's face. The small slug pinged against the ceramite, knocking Xarl's head back a little before ricocheting with a wet crack back into the man's own forehead. Xarl took one look at the deep red groove in the man's skull and dropped the corpse, swearing in Nostraman. He could hear that bastard Cyrion laughing over the Vox. He knew what they would say after this mission, how they already jested about his seemingly deft diplomacy. The ship was breaking around them as they charged to the outer hull. The ammunition was low. It was always low in this age of scavenging. But 4 bolters roared as they punched into the vacuum of space. First Claw was sucked out, Talos smashing his faceplate into the walls as Xarl snagged his leg. Pain flared over Talos' body as his lungs felt that they might explode. Blood washed over one eye lens as First Claw floated amongst the debris. The lights of a Thunderhawk washed over them as Septimus brought them into the hold. Wounded and before the Exalted, Talos didn't hide his anger. 5 Astartes had been lost, even before they had a chance to board the ship. Ripped apart in their drop pod, the warband had been bleeding strength for decades, just like his Narcusian gauntlet. The role of apothecary had fallen by the wayside. The Exalted licked its lips, espousing that it was a shame, but it was all worth the War Master's favour. Talos wondered if Abaddon even knew, the skeleton crew that now operated as the 8th Legion. On Crythe, First Claw heard the bolt rounds outside the meeting of Talos and Abaddon. Xarl, Cyrion and Uzas readied their weapons as they stared down the Black Legion guard. But the Atramentar beside them told them to stand down. There was no hope for the Prophet. What would they do? Declare war on the War Master and die here? Was the Exalted that jealous and threatened by the Soul Hunter, they thought? Or perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps he was being offered up to Abaddon, Would he choose to leave, just like Reuven had? Talos opened his eyes to nothingness. The invasion of Crythe had barely begun when he was summoned to the War Master's side, and upon its surface he had been betrayed. To one who usually saw through pitch darkness as naturally as a mortal man saw in daylight, this scene was both unwelcome and unfamiliar. He turned, still seeing nothing, unusual for an Astraman. He was unsure if this was because there was nothing to see in the blackness, or if he had lost his sight. It occurred to him with no small amusement that he'd inflicted this very fate upon so many mortals over the years, forcing them to awaken in the darkness of the Covenant's interior. A cautious smile spread across his lips as he enjoyed the irony. The air was cold on his flesh. The first hints of sensation. He could see himself now, his hands before his face, bone white and blue veined, and his tunic of dark weave. He was out of his battle plate. How could this be? Had the wound been so terrible that First Claw had to cut him out of his armor? And wait, his wound. His pale hands pulled open the front of his robe, bearing his chest to the darkness. His torso, a pale, sculpted echo of ancient Romani marble statues of their warlike gods, was unbroken by any wound. A figure, a Night Lord, spoke to him. This was the war. His soul was in the war, and if he embraced the ruinous powers like this figure, he could be powerful beyond imagining. Other figures manifested about him, one behind, one to the left, one to the right, taking the cardinal points around where he stood in the darkness. He couldn't focus upon them. Each time he turned, he saw nothing except the other, existing at the edges of his vision. Avatars of the gods of chaos manifested. Each figure a reflection of what he could be. Slaanesh, offering him perfection. His talents already infected his brother Cyrion. Talos recognized the next one, a weaver of fates. Vandred was already this one's slave, and then Karneth, a bloody reflection of himself. It offered strength. Uzas already offered skulls to it, and its power could soon be his. And at last, a rotted, bloated form who told him he had nothing to offer him. Talos told them all to go to hell. He had learned of these entities in the long wars, centuries before. They were a blight in this universe, a tool at most. He saw how it ruined those he once respected, and spat on that path. Black fluid vomited from him, and he began to wake. Talos opened his eyes, his real eyes. He was alive. Abaddon hadn't killed him. He had tried to corrupt him. Mortal humans with weapons stood over his body, curious and prodding. "Prey sight," Talos whispered. His helmet switched to targeting arrays. His arm snatched forward and throttled the first one. He rose quickly and killed the rest, interrogating the last for who his master is. Who cast his soul into the warp? Reuven, the human choked out as Talos murdered him. First Claw was gone. They had left Crythe. As Talos tried to contact them, but the Vox was dead. He ran towards the landing site of their Thunderhawk and found it covered in flame and blood. Septimus's body lay bloody and wounded within. They had taken her, Octavia the Navigator. Talos used his apothecarian training to stabilize Septimus. It kept his anger in check for that moment. They had tried to corrupt him. Vandred, Abaddon, Reuven, to make him a talented puppet, a personal prophet of the War Master. And now they had stolen his resource, his one advantage within the warband. He was going to kill them for this. The Soul Hunter left the Thunderhawk and began to run. He was on the hunt. His blood was pumping. He felt true purpose flood his veins, and it felt good. How long had it been? Reuven's lackeys, the ones who had taken Octavia, would be his prey. Once again, mortal men would know the fear of the Night Haunter's sons. For 6 minutes, a superhuman warrior darted through the rubble of Crythe, until the distinctive chatter of humans were picked up. Surrounding the beaten form of the navigator Octavia, the cultists of Reuven awaited their master, until a monster appeared from the shadows. Talos killed them faster than he wanted. He felt their fear and he heard their screams. As he played a little with his kill, he freed her from once the ballrooms and noble quarters of Terra, and now half beaten and dead in the crumbling ruins of an imperial city. The navigator, Octavia, thanked him. Feeling that made Talos uncomfortable, because for the first time in his life, he was in some light a hero. The voice of Reuven crackled over the box. Reuven of the Black Legion now. It had been decades since his abandonment of First Claw. Reuven asked how could Talos refuse the offer of the gods? Because he was his father's son, Talos told him. He was Talos of the Eighth. All he had left was his brothers and the ideals of the Night Haunter. He'd almost lost the asset Octavia, days after acquiring her. He'd almost lost Septimus, and had been offered on a platter to Abaddon. All so the War Master could weaponize his gift to vile gods. He spoke one last time to Reuven. Even during the Great Crusade, they had never liked each other. He promised that next time he saw him, he would kill him. The war on Crythe continued. The War Master's campaign had smashed and conquered most of the continent, and millions of Imperial defenders desperately tried to hold the line. In the orange haze of a setting sun, Talos, Xarl, Cyrion and Uzas rocketed down towards 7th Claw. They had already lost so many of their number. How many of their brothers would be sacrificed on the anvil of the Exalted and the War Master's battles? The survivors of 7th Claw, Ademar and Sergeant Mercutian hunkered down as the enemy approached. Looming above, the god machines of a greater age walked, its towering strides rumbling the earth as the titans of Mars stalked these traitors. Talos and First Claw dashed through as the recovered Septimus distracted it with a Thunderhawk. Talos had a plan, he told 7th Claw, and it was damn near suicidal. Septimus unleashed all the munitions upon the towering god machine shields. Talos couldn't help but watch as they flickered. He drew Orium and raised it, darting across the dust and rubble, and plunging it deep into the steel joints. First Claw placed the melted charges of their fallen brothers within the wounds and ran, only to see Uzas screaming in madness, exalting skulls and a throne. Talos tackled his brother and struck, trying to wake him, only for him to stare into the barrel of a plasma cannon the size of a tank. This is not where I die, he thought. He had not foreseen his death here, but the moments felt like an eternity. An explosion roared from the Titan's leg, and the towering hulk began to topple. The Princeps controller felt the pain sting through him, connected through his machine spirit, the pain transferring through the neural receptor network that tied God Machine to man. He opened his eyes to see the intruders who had now cut their way into this corpse. First Claw ascended within the machine, like parasites in a gut, until they came face to face with their prize. I am Talos, and you are coming with me. With the gene seed of their fallen brothers still bloody and wet on person, with a captured Princeps and a fallen Titan, Talos should have felt exalted, but he felt no victory, no glory. This war, the War Master's war, was pointless. He was still not over what Abaddon had tried to do to him, and on the macro level Abaddon threw them at opponents such as the Mechanicus, men whose 8th Legion tactics of fear and psychological warfare were wasted upon. One could not inflict fear into a thing half machine. They had lost too many brothers, and Vandrid, or the Exalted, was more concerned with the threat that Talos posed to his leadership. A leadership that Talos didn't even desire. Talos was done. To the Hall of Remembrance he strode. He took the remnants of 7th Claw, Adamar and Sergeant Mercutian, absorbing them into First Claw. He would brook no complaint from the Exalted. The clear hierarchies defined in the Crusade era were gone, but even the older Adamar and noble-born Sergeant Mercutian acquiesced to the Prophet. A strange sensation flowed through Talos, a feeling he had rarely felt in his life, a sense that he had to change, that he had hope. He had to choose something to drag them out of this pointless cycle. He hung over a precipice, and he knew there'd be no going back. 10th Company was gone. The warband of the Covenant was dying, but something could stem the tide. Deltrian, a figure robed in black, one who had augmented himself to the height of an Astartes, with none of the inhuman muscle bulk. To Talos he resembled the skeletal harvester of life from the pre-Imperial Terran mythology. It was an image shared across the stars by so many colonized worlds, even those that had evolved independently of far, far distant Earth. A reaper of souls. Deltrian's face, visible from under the black cowl, seemed to play with this conceit, for reasons Talos had never fathomed. A silver skull grinned at the Astartes. The face was formed from chrome and plasteel, shaped to the man's facial bones, perhaps even replacing the skin and bone itself. A Vox Sponder unit, like a coal-black beetle on his still human throat, emitted Deltrian's mechanical voice. There was an unusual tone of respect emanating from Talos' own voice, conversing with the Dark Mechanicum priest that had joined them since Horus's war. Talos had no need to be polite, because what he asked brought out the closest thing of human excitement from the tech priest. He asked him to awaken Captain Malcharian. This was his gambit. This could change the path of the warband, and most of all, it would deeply upset the Exalted. Xarl and Cyrion stood by the sleeping dreadnought sarcophagus, while the rites of awakening were performed. The disgust between the two was unbearable. The Astartes who felt fear. Cyrion, he wasn't worthy to be an Astartes to the duelist Xarl. They were joined by the noble-born Mercutian, who hadn't quite earned their trust yet, but there was something they all knew. This awakening would not go undisputed. Talos looked up. Joining him inside the elevator's shaft stood Malek of the elite Terminators, the Atramentar. That first company had been broken upon Sevatar's disappearance, their loyalty claimed by various warlords such as Vandred once. As a courtesy, Malek had come with a warning. He asked Talos if he was blind to what he was doing. Did he think he was the only one who held their father's counsel? The servitors, the navigator Octavia, the princeps prisoner. It all looked as if he, Apothecarian Talos, was trying to rebuild the company in his image. Should the Exalted's own navigator die or fail, all would look to Talos. And now he was making himself a target for the Exalted. The Vox pinged from Cyrion. It was beginning. Within the halls of remembrance the doors opened. A figure in Terminator plate, shouldering depictions of an Astraman saber cat, and armed with lightning claws that sparked with hateful energy. Xarl, the pet of the Exalted, licked his teeth and charged. The binaric and human screams of Deltrian were drowned out as Xarl, Cyrion and Mercutian fought desperately against the walking tank. Blood, sparks and bolterfire flew around the sacred chamber as First Claw were thrown around like dolls, only able to score minor hits against this beast. Cyrion's arm was cut off below the elbow, and Mercutian was down. Xarl prepared for the onslaught when a revving sound powered up. 6 explosive rounds capable of piercing through a tank eviscerated Xarl's body. Xarl looked to see a dreadnought walking forward. I heard bolt of fire. A voice emanated from distorted speakers. The War Sage had arisen. The command room had never been so full. The entire warband had come to witness the awakened Captain Malcharian, the war sage, the legend. The Exalted watched the dreadnought like a raptor, thinking of the mangled corpse that sat within. Two voices screamed in fear within the Exalted's body. Malcharian was a man feared by the human and the demon within. "You have changed," Malcharian said. "You are uglier than I remember. Hear me, Vandred. I have awoken, torn from an eternity of nightmares, each one a memory of our greatest failure. The Soul Hunter tells me that the war calls once more. You will tell me of that war." He was last a man fighting on the walls of Terra. 3 champions slain, their trophies added to his rack. And now he stood, half dead, but still the Legion's greatest relic, and an asset for Talos. A tool to steer the direction of the warband. First Claw prepared in their arming chamber. Once again, after months of battle, they were destined for Crythe. "How is the Voidborn?" Cyrion asked Septimus. The slave froze, concern barely hidden upon his half-mechanical face. The Voidborn, a child born to the slave population within the Covenant of Blood. A symbol of hope, even for the Astartes. A child born in a near lightless warren, hit close to home for the Nostramans within the Maw. Even Talos had offered her his personal protection. Murder was common within the dark and damp halls of the Covenant, between the mortal men and women, and especially the Astartes, who liked to practice the arts they honed during the Great Crusade on the unwilling victims. Once again, the warband landed upon Crythe. Imperial defenders were broken and crushed, as once again Malcharian the War Sage headed to battle. Even other Night Lord warbands looked on in awe at the machine of death, his autocannon booming as he screamed war chants over his scrambled Vox. It invigorated Talos to witness it, but at the height of their supremacy, the warning came through. The War Master had made another mistake. The Blood Angels chapter had broken through the rear guard in the void. The Covenant was going to be boarded immediately. The Exalted finally saw it, as the War Master ordered the Covenant to intercept like a sacrificial lamb. Finally, the War Master Abaddon had made too many mistakes. Talos was right. The Covenant of Fire dove. Flames scorched the surface as through a mangled mouth. The Exalted ordered all claws and the Night Lord warbands to retreat back to the Covenant. The war was over. The Eighth were never meant for an open fight, but if the Blood Angels were coming, they would kill them. Ave Dominus Nox, the Exalted spoke. We are being boarded by Blood Angels. Kill them all. Talos felt his soul sing as he stood beside First Claw. Xarl, Cyrion, Uzas, Mercutian and Adamar. Back aboard the Covenant, they hid within the shadows of the near-pitch black holes. Time in the Eye of Terror had left its mark, as warp taints were strong within these sections. First Claw fell down upon the advancing Blood Angels, Aurum cleaving through ceramite, and chain swords and bolters ripped apart the false Emperor's servants. The howls of Uzas only stopped as his mouth was filled with blood and torn out gene seed. Slowly the Night Lords picked apart the Blood Angel borders. Traitor, loyalist and human serf bodies piled high throughout the ship as the hours went on. First Claw pushed deeper as another wave of Ninth Legion suns flooded towards them, and then the ground began to rumble. Talos' black eyes widened as a walking tomb pounded at them. A Blood Angel's dreadnought bellowed out in challenge, only for an equally intimidating and emotionless voice to answer back. And that voice soothed Talos like a balm as Malcharian the War Sage entered the fray. The dreadnoughts clashed in a violent storm of metal and sound, each thrust shearing off ceramite as two titans fought amongst the men at their feet. First Claw and the War Sage fought like animals, the wounds on Talos pouring life essence as he felt his superhuman genetics fail to keep up with the damage being taken. Adamar, the veteran, died before him, and others collapsed due to their injuries. But when the last Blood Angel fell, silence reigned. The War Sage, Malcharian's dreadnought, lies still, tangled in the mess of the Blood Angel's warrior that had put him within it 10,000 years before. Talos, Xarl, and Cyrion dragged themselves to the Blood Angel's sarcophagus, cutting it open and gutting the mangled corpse with Orum's clean edge. Malcharian had earned his rest, though Talos had only awoken him a short time before. In defiance of the Exalted's will, Malcharian had earned his rest. Talos fell to the ground, his wounds pouring. He kicked over another Blood Angel corpse, claiming its armor for himself. The attack had been repelled, the fires faded, and the blood coagulated. Still a smoking ruin, the Covenant jumped into the warp. The Covenant of Blood was near broken after the escape from Crythe. First Claw had time to heal their wounds, until information came to them that changed everything. The Covenant drifted above an Imperial world. An ecclesiarchal priest cheered to the thousands and the millions, whilst within the shadows, a demon waited for its kill, only for the Lords of Night to ambush the very killer itself. First Claw captured an Imperial assassin, and the torture began. They would find what they needed. They would find the secret they know was being kept from them. Barely a mangled mess, and taking longer than expected, they found the truth of a rumor that had been spread to them. The warbands of the 8th Legion, a massing of thousands of Astartes, sieged an Imperial monastery. First Claw had the honor of leading the foot slog towards the walls. Out of the snow they passed the corpses and wreckage, delving within the monastery's catacombs, where they would eventually find it. Here they would find what they were looking for, an ancient recording, 10,000 years in its making, from M. Shen to the Inquisition. A damaged and static-ridden recording of the Night Haunter's last moments. It was sacrilege that the Imperials had ever had it. Legionaries cried under their helms, chanting Ave Dominus Nox, beginning in a low whisper into a thundering howl that rocked the very walls itself. Not since the death of their father had so many brothers been in one place. Not since the night that Talos lost his father had the Legion been whole. The warbands once again split as the Covenant sought to replenish. The Exalted's navigator had been assassinated by the Blood Angels, only leaving Octavia, Talos' slave, to take the mantle. In spite of the war they had suffered on Crythe, the warband's numbers had been swelled by other Night Lords of fellow warbands, caught out by Abaddon's failure. Even the Raptors of the Bleeding Eyes cult, tortured and twisted creatures by the warp that even First Claw was hesitant to share a room with. But the Covenant itself was in dire shape. The blood-soaked halls held a sorrowful, terrified air. Even the Void-born child, the symbol of hope, had been cut down during the Blood Angels' boarding. They needed to rebuild. Noble-born of Terra, Octavia assumed the Navigator's throne, and the Covenant once again entered the warp.
You will come with us to Vilimus.
I knew this was all going too well.
Cyrion voxed over a private channel. Talos ignored him.
That is the price of my aid. When we lay siege to Vilimus, your forces will be in the vanguard.
The seated figure added. Lord Huron's throne room in Hell's Iris was hardly devoted to any suggestion of subtlety. The station's war room had been converted to a monarch's chamber, repleted with a raised throne and rows of crusade banners hanging from the ceiling. Rows of bodyguards, supplicant and beseechers lined the walls, human, renegade, and creatures lost in the mutable state of those enthralled to chaos worship. The decking showed its stains with unwashed pride, blood, burns, and greyest slime in equal measure. while the air bore the stink of something sulphurous, rising from beneath the gathered warriors. It all added to the pain-muzzled buzzing inside the prophet's skull.
Nothing
Mercutian voxed quietly.
bears the same stench as a red corsair haven.
Talos had replaced his own helm upon entering the station.
We have to agree to his wishes. Huron won't let us leave alive if we refuse.
His offer is suicide.
Cyrion pointed out,
We should confer with the Exalted.
replied Mercutian. Xarl smiled behind his faceplate.
Well,
The enthroned figure asked. Lord Huron's ravaged features stared with delighted interest. He was not a man with a mind to hide his emotions, and what remained of his human face was twisted into a leer that bled superiority. He knew he had won even before these dregs of the 8th Legion came before him to beg, and he felt no qualms in showing the triumph across his brutalized visage. Yet, even in his monstrous exaltation, little of pettiness showed. He almost seemed to share the joke with First Claw. Talos rose from his knees. Behind him, First Claw did the same. Variel stood to the side, his face a careful mask of passionless boredom.
It will be done, Lord Huron. We agree to your terms. When do we sail?
Huron reclined in the osseous throne, the very image of an ancient, indecorous warlord.
as soon as my work crews have resurrected your broken covenant of blood, a month, maybe less, you will provide the materials.
Talos nodded.
The Ganges raid was most fruitful, my lord.
Ah, but you fled from the Marine's errand. Not as fruitful as the venture might otherwise have been, eh?
No, lord.
The prophet watched the warlord, wishing it was easier to dislike Huron's disarming informality. A strange, reluctant charisma bled from the Corsair Lord's wounded cuirass in a trickling aura.
I watched the Covenant drift in, you know. How you let such a grand ship fall into ruin is, I suspect, something of a tale.
It is, sire. I would be glad to speak of it at a more opportune time.
Talos conceded. Huron blinked his dry eyes. Mirth enlivened them, and his shoulder guards rattled with the laughter he kept beneath his breath.
Now seems the perfect time, Night Lord.
Around the chamber were the rumbling chuckles of legionary voices.
Let us hear the story now.
Talos swallowed, his mind racing beneath the pain. Huron's conversational noose was as simple and blunt as it was unavoidable. In a moment of foolish instinct, he almost glanced at Variel.
My lord,
The prophet inclined his head.
I believe you already know the vital aspects of our sufferance at Crythe. A more poetic voice than mine is required to do the tale any justice.
Huron licked his corpse lips.
Indulge me. Speak to me of how you betrayed the Black Legion and ran from the Blood Angels.
More laughter from the armed audience.
I curse the Exalted for sending us to do this.
Cyrion sighed.
He's baiting us.
Xarl's voice was low, cold. The prophet wasn't so sure. He bowed theatrically, feigning a role in the amusement at First Claw's expense.
Forgive me, Lord Huron. I forgot how difficult it must be for you to receive pure information on the war waged by the First Legions. Those of us who once walked at the sides of the Primarchs tend to forget how distant and isolated the lesser renegade Astartes must feel. I will tell you of Abaddon's preparations for the coming crusade, and the Night Lord's place within it, of course. I only hope you will enlighten us as to whatever games you and your pirates have been playing so far from the war's front lines.
As Talos's words fell across the silent chamber, Uzaz sniggered like a child over the vox.
And you rebuke Xarl for his diplomacy. You've killed us all. Prophet?
Mercutian sounded aghast. Talos said nothing. He merely watched the warlord upon the throne. The ranks of the Corsair stood at attention, waiting for the order to open fire. A stunted, inhumane creature skittered around their armored boots, cackling to itself. Huron, master of the Maelstrom, and the largest pirate war fleet in the eastern reaches of the galaxy, finally allowed his face to split into a smile. It took obvious effort to make the expression. The grin formed from twitching muscles and quivering, nerveless lips.
I would have liked to walk upon Nostromo. In my experience, its sons have an entertaining sense of humor.
Huron drummed his armored talons on the armrest of his throne, releasing a mouthful of laughter closer to a gargle.
I am glad to entertain you, Lord, as always.
Talos was smiling himself.
You are still a soul blinded by overconfidence, you know.
It is a curse.
The prophet agreed. The warlord gave another of his burbling, throaty chuckles, the sound of an unspat bile trapped in wounded lungs. Thin pistons compressed with clicks, visible through the patchwork skin of the warlord's throat.
And what if I'd not required you for this little task, Legionary? Then what?
Then you'd have aided us from the goodness of your own heart, Lord.
I can see why the Exalted loathes you.
The Corsair Lord grinned again. It bled the tension from the chamber in a rush of acidic breath. Huron rose, gesturing to the Night Lord with oversized metal claw. At the movement, the creature loping around the chamber, a hairless, wretched little quadruped with skinny malformed limbs, scampered over to the warlord and climbed Huron's armor plating with its knotty talons. The Corsair Lord paid it no heed as it clutched onto his back-mounted power pack, gripping with his taloned hands. Swollen eyes glared at the Night Lords, and its awkward teeth clicked together in a stuttering rattle.
What the hell is that?
Cyrion breathed. Talos whispered a reply.
I'm not sure I want to know.
It looks like someone skinned the spawn of a monkey and a dog. I believe one of you should tell the Blood Reaver that he has an abomination crawling over his back.
I think he knows, Sai.
Huron beckoned to them again, his claws squealing as its joints moved.
Come, warriors of the First Legions. I have something of yours that you may wish to see.
Huron's movements drew the prophet's eyes more than once. The master of the Red Corsairs was a shattered creature, but his dragging limp belied the suppressed power in every jerking movement. Seeing him now, this close enough that the slowly flickering light glinted back from his tarnished armor plating, it was no trouble at all to discern why the former tyrant of Badab remained alive. Some warriors were too stubborn to die. Had he been mortal, Talos suspected Huron's presence would be enough to cow him into obedience. Few other warlords exuded such an unpalatable aura of threat, born of a destroyed face, a pained smile, and the growl of fiber bundle cablings in his armor joints. But then, few other war leaders commanded a secessionist empire, let alone an astral kingdom of such immense size and might.
Something in my face interests you, Prophet?
Your wounds, my lord. Is there much pain?
Huron bared his teeth to the curious question. Both warriors were the painstaking product of extensive, archaic genetic manipulation and biosurgery, making pain a relative concept to post-human warriors with 2 heartbeats, 3 lungs, and the habit of spitting acid.
Great deal,
the Corsair Lord said, leaving it at that. Behind First Claw, the lumbering forms of the Red Corsair Terminators filled the corridor, plodding along in tank-like obstinance. The hairless little mutant scrabbled around their heels. Cyrion kept casting looks back at it.
Before I give you this gift,
Huron's tongue moistened his cracked lips again.
Tell me, Night Lord, why you risked that ludicrous jest with me in the throne room.
The answer came smoothly.
Your empire is a cancer webbing through the Imperium's heart, and it is said that you command as many warriors as any Legion Lord, except for the War Master himself.
Talos turned to glance at Huron, the warlord's broken features outlined by a target lock.
I do not know if that is true, Lord Huron, but I doubted such a man would be so petty or ungracious as to vent his anger over a few spoken words.
Huron's reply was no more than a flicker of amusement in his bloodshot eyes.
Will we even want this gift?
Xarl voxed to the others.
Not if it's what I think it is.
Cyrion's voice came back, a little distracted.
That little thing is still following us. I may shoot it.
Isekje kruku shivrik vagsika,
Huron announced, bringing them to a halt.
I do not speak any of the Badab dialects,
Talos confessed. Huron answered by gesturing to a sealed bulkhead door with a massive power claw. The curving talons had been painted the same red as his ceramite a long time ago, but battle had slowly disintegrated the weapon's appearance, leaving it scorched black from flame. The tyrant inclined his head to the Night Lords, and the overhead illumination strips reflected their light back off the chrome portions of his bare skull.
Here is what I wished you to see. Tormenting it has been both useful and entertaining, but I suspect you would take pleasure in seeing it as well. Consider this viewing a token of gratitude for accepting my offer.
The bulkhead began to rise, and Talos resisted the urge to draw his weapons.
Keep your helms on,
the tyrant warned. The Covenant of Blood struck the Ganges station, a Marines' errant chapter outpost, utilizing the captured princeps to forge a vox-resonant scream, and with Septimus infiltrating within, the warband struck, gathering supplies and slaves to refill the Covenant's halls. But Uzas, the mad dog, had let the bloodthirst overwhelm him, killing a member of Third Claw. Somehow, he seemed to be getting worse. Dal Karus of Third Claw knocked on the door, as Talos, Xarl, Cyrion and Mercutian stood over the strapped-down, raving Uzas. The vision kept coming to Talos, of Uzas attempting to kill Cyrion on a world of rain and lightning, a thing that had not come to pass. Sometimes his visions were wrong. First Claw had been debating on whether to kill Uzas themselves, when Third Claw had come for revenge. 7 legionaries stood outside the door, demanding Uzas. "Free me, Talos," Uzas spat through his guttural speech. "Let me stand in midnight clad." Talos knew he should kill him, but he was First Claw. All he had left was First Claw, broken and damaged as they were. The door exploded open as shrapnel and smoke burst from grenades. In the prey side spectrum, red lenses flared. They burst forth and began cutting. Talos felt the bolter rounds punch his new stolen armor. With each second, Third Claw fell one by one. They were no match. Dal Carriers stood last, begging to join First Claw. Why? Why didn't he just kill Uzas? This could have been done with. A bolter round silenced the weakling. Talos, Xarl, Cyrion, Mercutian, and Uzas stood, blood pouring from their wounds, and their armor utterly wrecked. Still bleeding, Talos was summoned by the Exalted, escorted by the creature Lucorphrius. The raptor's body had been long twisted by the warp. It suited him better to crawl on all fours rather than walk upright. His jump pack melded into his body. The rituals of the raptors, exalting their own dark creeds and own warp taint, disgusted Talos. In the Apothecarian, Talos stood before the thing that had once been Vandred, but instead of jealousy or even an ambush, the Exalted told him that he was right. He had been right for a long time. The warband was dying, even more after Crythe, and they needed to rebuild. A job for a former apothecary to start, but only one place could offer them those resources. A place they had been before and were despised. Talos felt his body shut down as he limped back to his holdings. In the near lightless corridor, a legionary stood before him, and it was the last person he wanted to see. Uzas. Now the tables were turned. Perhaps Uzas would kill him now. Uzas toyed with his gladius in his grip. Talos' vision swam, but he looked upon the bloody handprint on his brother's faceplate. He remembered the woman Uzas had crushed slowly, trying desperately to push away from the monster as a city burned around them. Uzas told him he was arrogant, so sure of himself, too proud to accept that he was just like the rest of them, just like their father, broken and monstrous. But no, only Talos believed there was some purity within him, as if holding to the old Nighthaunter's beliefs of justice actually meant something, like it changed who he was inside, and what he had done. Uzas let Talos go, and then he collapsed in his room as the Soul Hunter's body began to slowly heal. Visions swam again in his mind as his body convulsed. Nostramo detonating, Uzas killing Cyrion, and the Eldar, the very same ones that attacked Tsagulsa the night their father died. A storm in flesh, with a rain of blades, she who stalks the void, the storm of silence. Talos awoke quickly, finding his hand wrapped around Octavia's neck, as a loyal servant Hound pointed a gun at his face. He could have killed the blind old man for that. Talos let go as Octavia coughed. He didn't like being surprised. The new navigator of the Covenant had come to confide in her master, asking about his visions. Was she truly even interested? Or was it an opportunity to speak of what she'd truly come to say, telling Talos of the void-born child ghost haunting her? Octavia stared into a face that could have been handsome, if not ravaged by the Astartes process. Talos told her to go back to her throne room, ignore the machinations of the warp, because the Covenant would be traveling into the Maelstrom. To Hell's Iris the Covenant drifted. The blending of the warp and real space was madness and order perfectly combined. A continent of steel populated by carrion feeders, all under the domain of Huron Blackheart of the Red Corsairs. The renegade, the pirate king who commanded a force on a sector of space that rivaled a near legion size of old. The welcome wasn't warm. The last time Talos and the warband had docked here, it had ended in violence. First Claw stood before the Blackheart, and the exchange was tense. First Claw knew the only reason they lived was because the legionaries of the First Legions would be needed for a task. The Covenant would be repaired, of course, and Huron had a gift for them. Suspended in chains in a room so bright it stung the eyes, Reuven, former First Claw and now former sorcerer of Abaddon, hung. The singing light was pure torture to one born of Nostramo. Talos immediately drew his gladius knife and held it to his brother's cheek. He had promised he would kill him the next time he saw him. The traitor had been abandoned as Abaddon's pet, and bled of his secrets, hanging now emaciated to the point of death. Talos couldn't believe any words from his mouth. Reuven always lied. He had abandoned First Claw. He had thrown Talos to the War Master, thrown him before those so-called gods of the warp. First Claw chuckled as they left. Reuven's screams for help unsightly for a son of the Eighth. They left him to a fate worse than death. As the repairs of the Covenant began, Talos moved through the rotten walkways of the floating city of Hell's Iris. He clasped wrist to wrist with a brother, a man who wore the red and black of another warband, a man whose life Talos had saved decades ago on the world of Frigga. Variel, the apothecarian Variel, affectionately named the Flayer, for the living skin bound to his armor. crafted with the material of those who got on his nerves. Talos' midnight black eyes stared into the icy blue of Varial's. The Corsair Apothecarian never blinked, unnerving the mortals. Talos had come for supplies, but his old friend told him that he had noticed something wrong. The injury Talos had sustained during the confrontation with Third Claw, his roughly patched wounds by servitor hands were incomplete. A pressure was building in his head. Wasn't it? Talos hadn't told anyone. Varial was a better apothecary than Talos had ever been. Sustaining the mangled body of Blackheart had taught him that. Varial told Talos that he could fix him, but that required a level of trust Talos didn't even have for his own brothers. Trust was something an Astraman had never known. Trust got you killed in the streets in gang warfare. But Varial knew he would come. First Claw arrived later, but not for reassurance. Talos told Varial that they were here to hold him down. Often when Talos lost consciousness, he had visions. If it gave any surprise to Varial, he didn't show it. Life inside the warp storm, the Maelstrom, and Hell's Iris was already insane enough. Talos lay down upon the cold steel table and let the reconstruction of his skull begin. Over 4 hours, the visions came and went, his body periodically convulsing with pain. He saw Vandred, Sergeant Vandred saving his life during the heresy. He saw himself and Xarl upon the walls of Terra itself, the battle on which the nexus of mankind altered. He remembered the blood staining his hands as the gene seed storage was overfilled. He saw his father, the Night Haunter, Conrad Kurz, on Tsagulsa as the Legion gathered to their father. He saw the emaciated face, greying hair and mad grin, the demigod whose own memory seems to betray him. He saw Uzas with Octavia and her blind old attendant Hound and the Apothecarian. Uzas talking, justifying himself to her, ranting through ragged breaths about how he was not as mad as Talos thought him to be. And then a storm in flesh, with a rain of blades, she who stalks the void, the storm of silence, an Eldar witch. Talos opened his eyes. 4 hours of surgery later, Varial had saved his life. For now. No thanks came from Talos. The Nostramans never really had their manners. For a world whose language was eloquent and poetic, it was all for show. A tool to elevate the gang bosses and leaders, pretending to be something they weren't. Varial told him he would live, but there was a problem. The visions, they were not of the warp like sorcerers, but a byproduct of his maturing gene seed. A gene seed that was fighting his body. It was a miracle he'd even survived the implementation process in a galaxy long gone. Perhaps it was the sin of the father. Maybe he was just like Kurz, blessed with a gift the frame could not handle. That was why he convulsed and shook when they came. How did he feel about it? He never wanted this so-called gift anyway. To be the prophet. And if it killed him, was that how he wanted to die? Not in the heart of battle, but lying sick upon an apothecarian's table. Talos and First Claw returned to the Repairing Covenant. Soon the mission given by Huron Blackheart would take place. Besides the Atramentar Malek, and before the exalted Talos spoke, they were going to betray them. The Red Corsairs, of course. Sitting in the heart of the pirate fleet, thinking it would go unnoticed, floated a vessel. One whose true identity had been covered and masked. The Echo of Damnation. A vessel of the 8th Legion. How they had acquired it didn't matter, but the fact that these Corsairs laid their filthy hands upon the property of the 8th disgusted them. Perhaps even the crews were still mortal Nostramans. Talos had a plan, but the Exalted would dislike some of these elements. The warband would leave with the Covenant and the Echo when they were done with Huron. But first, Vilimus The claws of the warband ran rampant within the fortress monastery of the Marines errant upon Villamus. Talos cleaned the meat that clogged his chainsword. The chapter sirs were unworthy of Orum's edge. It was a shame. He admitted that he admired the Blackheart. His plan was well thought out, utilizing the expertise and experience of the 8th Legion to infiltrate and build fear while others sabotaged. The plunder was free, so long as Blackheart could take the Gene Seed vaults. The difference was night and day compared to the War Master Abaddon. Here stood an Astartes that listened and answered questions. His plans were meticulous and used assets well. It was almost a shame they were going to betray him. Xarl, Cyrion, Mercutian and Uzas were enjoying their time as they painted the Gothic halls red. Only Talos found it tedious. Like so many others, it was a battle devoid of greater glory. When had he started to think of greater glory? When had he started to think and dare believe in the greater picture? When the true battle came next for the echo of damnation, what then? What after that? Was this Reuven's influence? Talos told the Exalted he wouldn't like his plan, to take Octavia to the Echo and to free Reuven, having the traitor sorcerer pilot the Covenant. The warband asked for a gift of the prisoner Reuven. Blackheart agreed, believing the tortured sorcerer would suffer more at the hands of his brothers. But before Talos freed him, he had to know. Why? Why did he betray his legion? Why join the War Master? The truth was discomforting. What choice did he have? The 8th Legion is broken, Reuven told Talos. Lost to mindless slaughter and pillaging. The Great War isn't over. Horus failed. The Primarchs failed. Only he, Talos in his naivety, still worshipped the ground they walked upon. They were egotistical driven fools, and it wounded Reuven that the one chance they had risen from another legion, and not their own, not even an Astraman. Reuven still believed they could win. Did he? Talos? Talos released his chains, telling him his skills were needed, but if he betrayed them, then he would end him. Striding through the corridors of the Villamus Fortress Monastery, the Marine errant garrison had finally caught on. Lucofrius and his raptors had broken through the vital defenses with infiltration, as First Claw finally began to reconvene. Cyrion was late, almost looking as if he had been in a haze. More and more Talos begun to notice how Cyrion was off on his own, especially within the Coven's dark lower chambers. Uzas had again been lost to bloodlust. Talos knew this liability would have to be addressed soon. The bolt of fire began to ricochet around them as they took cover. First Claw and the Marines errant traded more, until a foul figure with an ugly charismatic smile stepped behind First Claw. The Red Corsairs had arrived. First Claw without any signal set behind them, shadows in the Corsairs' Terminators, mockingly telling them they were doing so well. Perfect shields. Talos gunned down more Marines, avoiding looking at the hairless creature that sat upon Blackheart's shoulder. The warp monster made First Claw's skin crawl. They hoped they could slaughter it and make it look like an accident in their minds. The numbers of Marines errant swelled again. Guttural swearing could be heard from the usually eloquent Mercutian. A helmetless warrior stared directly at Talos. He knew that look. The conviction he had worn when he had set out to the stars. That conviction was now like a void within him. One he would never admit out loud that he craved again. Blood and ceramite sprayed across the walls as the bark of bolters screamed. Locked within prey sight, First Claw peeked from over the covers of their thin-blooded kindred until Huron Blackheart himself charged. The melee was brutal and screeching until finally the Marines lay dead, cleaved in half or scorched by Huron's powered claw. The furious Huron turned to scold those bastard Nostramans for their cowardice, only to see that the Night Lords were gone. Talos looked back upon the fortress as the claws made their way back to orbit. "Are you ashamed?" said a voice spoken with such clarity it shocked Talos. Uzas. It was good to hear that voice, in a tone not heard since the Great Crusade. Yes, Talos was ashamed. All they ever did was run. But the important battle was not here. It was going to be in the stars. Varial stood beside the command throne of the Echo. He had to make a choice. Talos had come to him alone, speaking of what the Night Lords were planning, and its success was hinged upon Varial's betrayal of Huron and the Corsairs. Frigga was decades ago. He'd already paid his debt to Talos. The surgery was enough. He didn't have to do this. Talos and First Claw had assembled back onto the Covenant, the Raptors and Claws all boarding torpedoes as the Exalted fired them upon the Echo of Damnation, sending away Octavia, their navigator, with them. Reuven could guide the ship within the warp, but he was no navigator. This was a risk. First Claw felt the screech and then punch as the boarding torpedoes bit its way through the outer hull. Octavia adjusted the bandana on her third eye, trying to block out the whispers of the entity taunting her. Even with the comfort of Septimus's presence, it didn't help. First Claw had begun to notice the bond between them. The long-dead void-born child again. Her confession to Talos hadn't made her feel any safer, even when the entity had tried to kill her before on the Apothecarian, possessing the corpse of Dalcarius of Third Claw, who had tried to kill Talos, and died at his hands only days before. The Voidborn was here on the Echo too, an omen of death to come. The claws of the Night Lords raced through the ship, slaughtering those who stood in their way, but most of the mortal crew knelt, with charcoal black eyes staring once again at their true masters. The natives of Nostramo submitted. To the bridge Talos joined Varial, the corpse of the Corsair commander still on the floor next to him. The Flayer had made his choice. It relieved Talos to see that he had chosen and trusted right. Trust was an unusual sensation. The rest of the Corsair Marines were dissolved in the soul storm, caught in the blur of the Echo's warp jump by Varial's design. It was the worst death Talos could ever think of, ripping one's soul apart, and it even made him shudder. Varial told him he thought it would impress him, and Talos told him that it did. Talos looked to the throne, choosing not to sit in it. For now. The Echo left the warp and made hail to the Covenant, but there was a problem. The Vox hails were silent. They hadn't made the full distance to the rendezvous point. Octavia. Something was wrong inside the navigator's chamber. Octavia spluttered up more sick, as the strain of piloting the Echo was too much. The once proud Astartes vessel had become too soaked in the taint of the warp, and they didn't have time to properly cleanse it, pushing herself to her limits, much to the dismay of Septimus, his fondness evident. The Echo was hours behind, but finally it caught up to the Covenant. Cyrion spoke in disbelief. All of First Claw saw it. Talos, Cyrion, Xarl, Mercutian, and Uzas. The Red Corsair's vanguard fleet had caught up to the Covenant. Their home burned, but it roared through the enemy formation. 4 Corsairs' ships destroyed as 12 honed in on the Predator in its midst. The Exalted had raged when the Echo still hadn't arrived. He thought the Prophet had betrayed him, despite the reassurances of the Atramentar. Was this what the Soul Hunter had always planned? Leaving him with that rat of a traitor Reuven, instead of a navigator. But the Corsair ships had started to arrive, and the answer to that question would have to wait. The Exalted sat in his throne and prepared for war. Did these Thin Bloods really think they came close to matching his void skill? The Covenant tore through the formation, taking colossal damage but dealing out more in revenge tenfold. In disbelief, Talos hailed the Covenant, as he stared at the flaming wreckage desperately battling alone. a voice hailed back. But this was Vandred, not the Exalted. The Exalted Demon. The pact formed in those days since the heresy had swallowed up the man that Talos knew. A symbiotic relationship that provided power, but drank from Vandred's memories like a feasting animal. The Covenant was dying, and in his panic the demon had drunk too deeply, allowing the mind of Vandred to scream to the forefront one last time. Vandred told Talos to run. There was no point in both ships dying here. Talos paused. It was good to speak to the man he respected, the man he was before chaos had corrupted him, before they had butted heads for over a century, but all that hate was washed away in a second. He told Vandred he would be remembered. The blood poured from Vandred. The ice began to creep around him as the void entered in. He told Talos he would rather not. He blared abandoned ship across the Covenant and prepared to die. He let go his control, his last words telling the demon he hoped this hurts. The refugees from the Covenant began to pour in, from the serfs to the Marines, Legion relics and even Deltrian the Tech Priest and his servants. Reuven walked up to Talos, exclaiming his survival, but Talos just moved past him. He'd hoped that he had died aboard the Covenant rather than join them. The warband watched as the Covenant of Blood died, but the Echo wasn't jumping to the warp. Again, something was wrong. A hulking creature, wearing legionary plates, stomped towards the door of the navigator chamber. The void-born entity had possessed Caleb, a surviving corsair from Varial's sabotage. Xarl, Uzas, and Lucafrius had begun their hunt, following the trail of Night Lord corpses. The doors were broken down. Octavia's guard hound and Septimus fired as the swelled body of Caleb towered towards them. 2 shots from Hound's weapon eviscerated his face, leaving his tongue whipping around. The creature snapped the blind old Nostraman in a wet crunch. Septimus looked to Octavia and told her to run. Talos' slave prepared for death. It had been a miserable life, raised in a world that didn't even speak Imperial Gothic, a meaningless life until he was taken as a slave, forced to serve creatures that were nightmare, and only until now did he have something to fight for. Death was coming, until a figure burst from behind them. Uzas, revving his chain axe as Xarl followed close behind. The possessed creature tossed them around and bloodied them, until Lucafrius and his raptors descended from the ceiling and devoured it. Octavia wept over the body of her guard, as Septimus comforted her. The battle was over, as the Echo finally jumped into the warp. Peace and silence reigned. Talos entered Uzas's chamber. The problem: the raving mad dog who had run rampant on too many missions. The reason for Third Claw's ambush. The one responsible for the piling bodies in the serf quarters. It was hard to judge him for that, for Talos himself at times had hunted the mortals for pleasure. But the murder of one, such as the grieving Voidborn's father, who had survived the Blood Angels massacre above Crythe, that had been a bridge too far. Perhaps that had created the entity, but most of all the vision that haunted Talos still, as much as the Eldar, the vision of Cyrion's death at Uzas's hands. Talos ordered Uzas to don the red gauntlets, an Nostraman tradition for a dead man walking, but one who still has debts to pay before the end. And only Talos had the right to give this to him, because now he was in charge. There was no more time for hesitancy. First Claw stood, gathering around Talos. Reuven entered the throne room and looked upon First Claw, Talos and Orym, Xarl and his 2-handed chainsword, Mercutian and his heavy bolter, Cyrion flexing his bionic arm, Uzas picking away at his chain axe with red gauntlets, and the new one, Varial toying with his Narcuthium gauntlet. First Claw. Something the sorcerer had been a part of once, and something he thought he would one day rule again. But Talos stood up and began walking slowly towards him. Reuven spattered blood from his lips as Talos' boot pressed upon his chest. Everything below his sternum had been ripped off. The traitor felt his strength flood away as Talos raised Orum's golden edge and placed it down Reuven's throat. He could never trust him. Every word he had spoken or would speak would be a lie, and even on Crythe he had promised that one day he would kill him. Now that day had come. First Claw watched dispassionately until the traitor finally died. Talos ordered Reuven's skin to be flayed, and his bones hung above the command throne. An example to all. It was now thrust upon him. The responsibility he never thought he would desire. But just as Malcharian had left a void filled by Vandred, Talos assumed the mantle. They would not just survive. They had a war to fight. The Night Haunter's will to honor. He would not languish with no glory anymore. Survival was not enough.
It is not enough. We stand in the dust at the end of centuries of useless sin and endless failure. The Legion was poisoned, and we sacrificed an entire world to cleanse it. We failed. We are the sons of the only Primarch to hate his own Legion. There, again, we failed. We swore vengeance on the Imperium, yet we run from every battle where we don't possess overwhelming force over a crippled enemy. We fail again and again and again. Have you ever fought a battle you'd struggle to win, with no hope of running away? Have any of us? Have you ever, since the siege of Terra itself, drawn a weapon with the knowledge you might die? I will not see my life hoard away without meaning. Do you hear me? Do you understand me, Prince of Cowards? I want vengeance against a galaxy that hates us. I want Imperial worlds to cower when we draw near. I want the weeping of this Empire's souls to reach all the way to Holy Terra, and the sound of suffering will choke the corpse god on his throne of gold. I will cast a shadow across this world. I will burn every man, woman, and child, so the smoke from the funeral pyres eclipses the sun. With the dust that remains, I will take Echo of Damnation into the sacred skies above Terra, and rain the ashes of 20 million mortals down onto the Emperor's palace. Then they will remember us. Then they will remember the Legion they once feared. No more running. No more running. No more raiding to survive. When we see an Imperial world, we will no longer ask if it is worth attacking for plunder. We will ask how much harm its destruction would cause the Imperium. And when the War Master calls us for the 13th Crusade, we will answer him. Night by night, we will bring this Empire to its knees. I will cast aside what this Legion has become, and remake it into what it should be. Do I make myself clear? Do I make myself clear?
A storm in flesh, with a rain of blades. She who stalks the void. The storm of silence. The rain was pouring down, as if this hateful world was mourning the blood spilled. Talos was kneeling. His wounds were pouring blood, and words he tried to speak were lost in the tide of liquid pouring from his smashed lips. The murderess, the Eldar witch, stood triumphant above him. Cyrion didn't die first, but his was by far the worst. The alien witchfire torching his body. Xarl, duelist champion Xarl, was the first to die, hacked to pieces in a death not worthy of him. Mercutian, miserable, loyal, noble-born Mercutian, fell standing over his brothers' bodies, and Variel died in the fire that enveloped Cyrion. Uzas died last, covered in alien ichor and screaming blood for the Skull Throne. The scene changes. A miserable and dark hive city where Octavia runs. She wears the coat of Septimus, one he would never have given up. She looks unwell. Pale fingers cover a swollen belly as members of the Inquisition finally converge upon her. The vision comes again. Talos stares into the face mask of the murderous demigod, whose blade is slick with 8th Legion blood in the reigns of Tsagulsa. Valas Morovai, he utters through a broken jaw. First claw, the alien speaks in the human Gothic tongue. The disgust is evident on her face for using such a primal language. They were your brothers. You call out to the dead in hopes they will save you. A thrumming sound builds up. An 8th Legion gunship roars in and fires upon the alien. The creature darts into the shadow faster than Anastate's eyes could see. Master, a voice blares from the ship. Talos looks up, and through one swollen eye he sees loyal Septimus and Octavia. Talos screams back that they are dismissed from his service for the second time. Leave. Flee this accursed world. Run far. If Variel survives, then he will come for the child. Talos wasn't leaving, for she had killed his brothers. With his shattered ribs, failing vision and bleeding wounds, Talos stood and chased after his fate. Talos opened his eyes, the familiarity of his arming chamber a little comfort to what he had dreamed. His muscles still felt tense and sore, but he began to rise. He was alone. The echo looked abandoned. A voice called out to him, emanating from the stained bows that hung above his command throne. The bones of a traitor whose voice spoke from a realm from beyond understanding. This was surely another dream, though it matched no vision he had ever seen. I am here, Talos said aloud. The voice echoed again. You have been dreaming many dreams. Now you are close to waking once more. Sit, brother. Talos didn't smile. He rarely did, even when amused. Though it was most definitely amusing to be told to take a seat in his own command throne. Talos complied, even if only to see what would happen. Again the voice spoke. Almost close enough to touch. That prickled at the prophet's skin. He looked up at Reuven's crucified remains. You are not the warrior you should be, but you and I must speak. It must be here, and it must be now. There will never be another chance. Talos remained seated, the very picture of stoic patience. He refused to let his anger or doubts rise to the surface. Targeting reticles slid by without gaining a grip on Reuven's shattered skeleton. You made my corpse into the finest decoration. That is almost amusing. Again the voice spoke. Talos reclined in the throne the way he did on the true bridge, and said, Can even death not render you silent? Your own life is measured in months, prophet. Reuven's skull spoke, suspended on chains, leered with empty eye sockets. "Is that so?" Talos asked it. "And how do you come by this precious lore?" Reuven's skull spoke again. "Do you pretend this moment has no significance? Do you believe I cannot hear your hearts beat faster? You remember nothing, do you? You have come to seek a pure war, a noble war. But you should have never returned to the Eastern Fringe. Others have been waiting for your return, with revenge in their hearts." The prophet remained as he was, still stroking his blade's wingspread hilt. The Eastern Fringe. He couldn't think of anything that would drive him back there. "I think you lie, Husk," said Talos. The bones of Reuven rattled. "Why would I lie? You run from the Eye. You run from the Eldar. You run from the doom at the hands of the alien witches. Better to flee to the other edge of the galaxy." Perhaps there was truth in that, but the prophet felt no urge to confess it. Talos stared up at the wreckage of the crucified bone, wishing his haunted voice would cease. "Why are you fighting this war?" The prophet snorted and replied, "For vengeance." "Revenge? For what?" Talos spoke again. "To avenge the wrongs done to us." "What wrongs do you speak of?" The voice echoed. Talos rose to his feet, feeling his skin crawling at the back of his neck. "You know what wrongs. You know why the 8th Legion fights. The 8th Legion doesn't know why it fights. You conceive excuses to justify a lifetime of wasted hate. The Legion fights only because it is amusing and pleasurable to dominate weaker souls." Unadulterated fantasy, Talos laughed, though he'd never felt less like laughing. He considered shooting the chain skeleton down from his ungainly crucifixion, though it was doubtful whether the act of spite would achieve anything. We rebelled because we had to rebel. The Imperium's pacifism was destined to fail. Order can only be maintained through keeping its souls fearful of retribution. Control through fear. Peace through fear. We were the weapon mankind needed. We still are. The bones rattled. The Legion never fought for those ideals. Your delusion was never even popular amongst our ranks. And even that faded. When the truth came, you cling to your illusions. More now because hate is all you have left. Talos drew in a breath. Hate is all I need. He drew the bolter now, aiming both barrels up at the corpse's shattered ribcage. My hatred runs pure. We deserve vengeance against the Empire that abandoned us. We were right to punish those worlds for their sins, and threaten others with destruction if they broke our laws. Control through fear. The systems we pacified. The bones rattled again, interrupting him. The systems we pacified were barely human anymore. We made populations into cowering animals, just possessed of free will, living in terror of breaking the law, like the whipping herds of humans living in the bowels of our warships now. And I stand by what I did, said Talos. The prophet was aware of how maddening his stance was. But what else did he have? The bones again spoke. Many of our brothers never cared for any of those ideals. That is no secret. It is why Kurz destroyed Nostromo, to stem the flow of poison into the 8th Legion. And it is why we were punished by the Imperium. We became the very thing we warned whole worlds about. We were the killers, and the murderers we told them never to be. Free to slay at will, and free from retribution. There was a long pause before Talos spoke in reply. He hated us. I know that for certain. Kurz also loved us. Kurz loved us and hated us in equal measure. Talos returned to his throne. His voice softened by contemplation. Ideas danced and died behind his black eyes. Our way was not the way of the Imperium. Talos quoted the ancient adage, but we were right. if the Legion has stayed pure. But it did not, the bones replied. The Legion was tainted by sin the moment the first Nostraman-born warriors swore his oath of service, for we were not the warriors he wished us to be. A tremor quivered through the ship's bones. Reality is slipping through now. Reuven's voice spoke more clearly. The echo of damnation arrived at his destination, but you should never have come to the eastern fringe. Talos looked up again in confusion. The corpse hadn't moved. You said that before, but I don't recall ordering such a thing. So you ordered it in search of a pure war, to elevate the warband and seek answers to the doubts that plague you. By walking upon Tsagulsa once more, nothing I say now is revelation. I speak only the same truths you are too proud to speak aloud. You have been hollow for a long time, brother. You know why you have always known. Some human children are not meant to carry gene seed. It breaks them apart at the genetic level. Some die fast, some die slow, but after 3 centuries of biological flux, your genetic incompatibilities are finally catching up to you. 55 days, and now Talos truly opened his eyes. He was surrounded by First Claw, chained to the command throne as others looked at him, with a mix of concern and awe. The visions had begun in his quarters, but he had taken off, killing and running through the ship until the crew had become nervous. Morale had been high, following a successful raid upon a space hulk, an encounter with gene sealers and the thin-blooded modern salamanders of the Primarch Vulcan stock. It had been fruitful. A squad of Terminator-patterned armor, an elite weapon was a prize that Tech Priest Deltrian had almost exulted over. But now their so-called leader was either dead or mad, chained to his throne, speaking in visions of the future, and he became an icon of worship, something that made Talos deeply uncomfortable. Tsagulsa. The Legion's 1-second home was visible from the viewport, an order given by Talos during his visions, something he didn't even remember saying. 10,000 years had rusted this hateful and barren world, but upon it sat a stain the Eighth could not bear. It had been settled by the Imperium. Even here, so far from the Astronomicon's light. No, this was and would always be 8th Legion. Even if the Black Fortress of Kurz was barely a ruin, Talos ordered the Claws to prepare. A population needed to die, but first, to the Navigator's quarters. First Claw told him it was important to speak to Octavia.
We had a fortress here, long ago. A castle of black stone and twisting spires. The Primarch dreamed of it one night, and set hundreds of thousands of slaves to making it. It took almost 20 years.
He paused, and Octavia watched the passionless skull of his face mask, waiting for him to continue. Talos exhaled in a vox growl.
The inner sanctum was called the Screaming Gallery. Have any of the others ever spoken of this before?
She shook her head.
No, never.
The Screaming Gallery was a metaphor of a kind. A god's torment, expressed in blood and pain. The Primarch wanted to reshape the external world to match the sin within his mind. The walls were flesh, humans molded and crafted into the architecture, formed as much from sorcery as ingenuity. The floors were carpeted in living faces, preserved by feeder servitors.
He shook his head, the memory too strong to ever fade.
The screaming, Octavia. You have never heard such a sound. They never stopped screaming. The people in the walls, crying and reaching out. The faces on the floor, weeping and shrieking.
She forced a smile she didn't feel.
That sounds like the warp.
He glanced at her and grunted acknowledgement.
Forgive me. You know exactly what it sounds like.
She nodded, but didn't say anything else.
The foulest thing was the way you'd become immune to the wailing chorus. Those of us who attended the Primarch in his last decades of madness spent much of our time in the Screaming Gallery. The sound of all that pain became tolerable. Soon after, you found yourself enjoying it. It was easier to think when surrounded by sin. The torment first became meaningless, but afterwards, it became music.
The prophet fell silent for a moment. That was what he wanted, of course.
He wanted us to understand the Legion's lesson as he believed it to be.
Octavia shuffled again as Talos knelt by her throne.
I see no lesson in mindless brutality.
He unlocked his collar seals with a breath of air pressure and removed his helm. She was struck, once again, by the thought that he'd been handsome, but for the cold eyes and the corpse-white skin, he was a statue, a scarred demigod of clean marble, dead-eyed, beautiful in his sterility, yet unlovely to look upon.
It was not mindless brutality. That was the lesson. The Primarch knew that law and order, the twin foundations of civilization, are only maintained through fear of punishment. Man is not a peaceful animal. It is a creature of war and strife. To force the beasts into civilization, one must remind them that excruciation awaits those who harm the herd. For a time, we believed the Emperor wanted this of us. He wanted us to be the angels of death, and for a time, we were.
She blinked for the first time in almost a minute. In their many long discussions and reflections, he'd never spoken of this in such detail.
Go on.
She pushed.
Some say he betrayed us. Once our use was complete, he turned against us. Others claim that we'd merely taken our self-appointed role too far and had to be put down like animals ourselves for slipping our leashes.
He saw a question in her eyes and waved it away.
None of that is important. What matters is how it began, and how it ended.
How did it begin?
The Legion had taken immense casualties in the Crusade in service to the Emperor. Most of those were Terran. They came from Terra, from the Emperor's wars across humanity's birth planet. But all of our reinforcements came from our homeworld, Nostromo. Decades had passed since the Primarch last walked upon the world's surface, and his lessons of law had long since died. The population slid back into lawless anarchy, with no fear of punishment from a distant Imperium. Do you understand how we were poisoning ourselves? We were repopulating the Legion with children who were the blackest sinners before they'd even tasted adulthood. The Primarch's lessons meant nothing to them, meant nothing to most of the 8th Legion at the end. They were slayers, raised to become demigods, with the galaxy as their prize to plunder. In wrathful desperation, the Primarch burned our homeworld. He destroyed it, breaking it apart from orbit with the firepower of the entire Legion fleet.
Talos breathed, low and slow.
It took hours, Octavia. All the while, we remained aboard our ships, listening to vox calls from the surface, sending their screams and pleas up to us in the heavens. We never answered, not even once. We stayed in space and watched our own cities burn. At the very end, we watched the planet heaving, breaking apart from the fleet's rage. Only then did we turn away. Nostromo disintegrated into the void. I have never seen anything like it again. I know in my heart I never will.
A moment of foolishness almost made her reach out a hand to touch his cheek. She knew better than to give in to that instinct. Still, the way he spoke, the look in his black eyes, he was a child, grown into a god's body without a man's comprehension of humanity. No wonder these creatures were so dangerous. Their stunted psyches worked on levels no human could quite comprehend. Simplistic and passionate one moment, complex and inhumane the next.
It didn't work. The Legion was poisoned by then. You know that Xarl and I grew up together, murderers even as children. We joined the Legion late, when Nostromo's venom was already rich in the Legion's veins. And believe me when I say that where he and I grew up, among the street wars and the cheapness of human life, it was one of the more civilized regions of Nostromo's inner cities. Much of the planet was in the throes of devolution, lost to urban wastelands and scavenger armies. As the strongest candidates, they were usually the ones chosen for implantation and ascension to the 8th. They were the ones to become legionaries.
Talos finished with a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
By then, it was too late. Primarch Kurz was in the throes of degeneration himself. He hated himself, he hated his life, and he hated his legion. All he craved was one last chance to be right, to show that he'd not wasted his entire existence. The rebellion against the Emperor, that war of myth that you call the Horus Heresy, was over. We'd turned against the Imperium that sought to punish us, and we'd lost. So we ran. We ran to Tsagulsa, a world outside the Imperium's borders, away from Terra's beacon of light that he claimed still stung his eyes.
He gestured at the grey world.
We ran here, and here is where it ended.
Octavia's breath left her lips as mist.
You fled a war you lost and constructed a castle of torture chambers. How noble of you, Talos. I still see no lesson in it.
He nodded to that, conceding the point.
You have to understand that by the end, the Primarch was riddled through by madness. He cared nothing for the Long War, wanting nothing beyond bleeding the Imperium and vindicating his life's path. He knew he was going to die, Octavia. He wanted to be right when he died.
Septimus told me of this. But raiding the Imperium's edges for a couple of centuries at the behest of a madman and slaughtering entire worlds is hardly a lesson of worthy ideals.
Talos watched her with his soulless eyes unwavering.
In that light, perhaps not. But humanity has to know fear, Navigator. Nothing else ensures compliance. By the very end, when the Screaming Gallery was the Legion's war room and council chamber alike, the Primarch's degeneration had devoured him from within. He was rendered hollow by it. I still remember how regal he looked to us, how majestic our father was to our adoring eyes. But looking at him was like growing used to a disgusting smell. You could forget the foulness, just as you can ignore the scent. But when something reminds you of it, you perceive it with renewed strength. His soul had rotted away by the end, and on some nights you could see it in the flash of his dying eyes, or the bleak shine of his teeth. Some of my brothers asked if he were tainted by some outer power, but most of us no longer cared. What did it matter? The end result was the same.
The same lights chose that moment to flicker and fail. The warrior and the mutant remained in the darkness for several heartbeats, illuminated only by the eye lenses of his power armor and the grey glare from the screens.
That's happening more and more lately. The Covenant hated me. The Echo seems to hate all of us.
An intriguing superstition,
he replied. The lights, dim as they were, came back on. Talos still didn't continue.
And the assassination?
She prompted.
The assassination came soon after, when his mad clarity was at its height. I have never seen a creature so placidly delighted by the thought of its own destruction. In death, he would be vindicated. Those who break the law must be dealt with in the most violent, lethal way, as an example to all who would consider betrayal. So he set us butchering across the galaxy, breaking every law against reason and rhyme, knowing the Emperor would prove the point all too well. The assassin came to slay Kurz, the great breaker of Imperial law. And she did just that. I saw him die, vindicated, pleased for perhaps the first time in centuries.
That's grotesque.
Her heartbeat quickened at the thought he would take offense, but her fear was unfounded.
Maybe so. The universe has never seen a living being that loathed being alive as much as my father. His life was broken in seeking to prove how humanity could be controlled, and his death was a sacrifice to prove that the species was ultimately wretched.
Talos withdrew a hololithic orb from his belt pouch and thumbed the activation rune. A life-sized image of flickering blue light manifested before them both. A figure rose from an unseen throne, its hunched, feral posture still not entirely stealing the beauty of its muscled physique, or the savage nobility in its movements. The distortion robbed the image of clarity, but the figure's face, a wraith visage of black eyes, gaunt cheekbones and filed fangs, was set in a vicious grin of sincere amusement. The Night Haunter. Mercutian recorded the deeds of their brothers, those that had passed during the heresy and the siege of Terra, and the battles since. Cyrion had given Octavia's attendants a legionary gladius, a precious gift. Even Xarl, the poor diplomat, had visited. Surprising of all, Uzas, who seemed to speak less of blood, was starting to form more coherent speech. A stark contrast to the reoccurring vision of a mad berserker trying to kill Cyrion. What surprised Talos the most was that Octavia seemed to know more about his brothers than he did, even after centuries of war, centuries of living by their side. Though a mutant navigator from a noble Terran house was human, he was a weapon trying to find a purpose since his father's death. Perhaps there could be some understanding between them, but then he heard it. Not one, but two heartbeats. One emanating from Octavia's belly. Talos left immediately. As soon as Septimus heard the door open, he knew he was going to die. The dark-haired man tried to turn around, but Talos grabbed his slave and threw him across the room. Septimus's head split, and in over a dozen places bones broke. Talos had warned him. Octavia was the most precious resource on this ship. The child within her would affect her ability to navigate the warp. For the first time in his life, a slave drew weapons upon him as Septimus grabbed his pistols. 7 slaves. Some died of old age, some were murdered, some were tainted and had to be put down, but none had ever betrayed him. Fear had kept them in line. Even this man, who we had plucked from a backwater to arm and repair his equipment. Anger emanated from Talos as he placed his foot upon Septimus's back. The slave had done much for him. There was sentiment there, but most importantly, usefulness. Talos spared his life, telling him if he ever approached her again he would join Reuven above his throne. Talos left as the near-dead Septimus fell unconscious. The drop to Tsagulsa was imminent. Xarl had been silent for a long time, but finally he spoke up. Why? Why make some big play now? Where has this so-called motivation come from? This bitterness of the existence they had under Vandred the Exalted. I have carried this bitterness for a long time, Xarl, said Talos. The only difference is now I wish to speak of it. And I do not regret it. To speak of these flaws is like lancing a boil. I already feel the poison bleeding from me. It is no sin to wish to live a life that matters. We are supposed to be fighting a war and inflicting fear in the name of our father. We are sworn to bear his vengeance. Xarl didn't hide the confusion taking hold over his pale features. Are you insane? How many among the Legion truly paid heed to the rantings of our mad Primarch, spoken so long ago? Talos countered. I am not saying the Legion has heeded those words. I am saying we should heed them. If we did, our lives would be worth more. Xarl stepped forward. The Legion's lesson is taught. It was taught when he died. All that remains is to survive as best we can, and wait for the Imperium to fall. And what happens when it falls? What then? Xarl looked at Talos for a moment. Who cares? Talos held his brother's gaze. No, that is not enough. Not for me. His muscles bunched as he clenched his teeth. Talos moved forward, immediately restrained by Mercutian and Cyrion, who struggled to hold him back. It is not enough. We stand in the dust at the end of centuries of useless sin and endless failure. The Legion was poisoned, and we sacrificed an entire world to cleanse it. We failed. We are the sons of the only Primarch to hate his own Legion. There again we failed. We swore vengeance on the Imperium, yet we run from every battle where we do not possess overwhelming force over a crippled enemy. We fail again and again and again. Have you ever fought a battle you'd struggle to win, with no hope of running away? Have any of us? Have you ever, since the siege of Terra itself, drawn a weapon with the knowledge you might die? I will not see my life thrown away without meaning. Do you hear me? Do you understand me, Prince of Cowards? I want vengeance against a galaxy that hates us. I want Imperial worlds to cower when we draw near. I want the weeping of this Empire's souls to reach all the way to Holy Terra, and the sound of suffering will choke the corpse god on his throne of gold. I will cast a shadow across this world. I will burn every man, woman, and child so the smoke from the funeral pyres eclipses the sun. With the dust that remains, I will take the echo of damnation into the sacred skies above Terra, and rain the ashes of 20 million mortals down onto the Emperor's palace. Then they will remember us. Then they will remember the Legion they once feared. No more running. No more running. No more raiding to survive. When we seek an Imperial world, we will no longer ask if it's worth attacking for plunder. We will ask how much harm its destruction would cause the Imperium. And when the War Master calls us for the 13th Crusade, we will answer him. Night by night, we will bring this Empire to its knees. I will cast aside what this Legion has become, and remake it into what it should be. Do I make myself clear? The minor hives of Tsagulsa, whatever this Imperial scum had renamed the world to, burned. The people screamed and ran, as their so-called militia defenders drew their weapons, but then fled in terror with them. Through red lenses the claws hunted the falling Imperial city. Talos and Xarl breathed in the fear as they stood atop a structure. It had been too long since they had felt this terror. They were the broken monsters their father despised, because they were enjoying this. Though again Talos not as much as his brothers. But a problem soon arose. The desperate calls for help from the humans in this backwater had been answered, and Astartes' vessel entered the system. The claws raced back to the Echo as the ship was under fire. Talos felt that distant dull pain since Crythe now throbbed behind his eyes. The visions were right. Varial was right. He was dying. Slowly by his implementation. Some humans did not mesh with Gene Seed as well as others. No matter what, this campaign on Tsagulsa felt like his last. A confrontation with a mortality he knew would end. To die outside of battle was not enough. To leave this cruel universe without holding to his father's teachings was not enough. The Vox became alive with commands, as did the Ceramite corridors with bolter fire. The Genesis chapter, a pitiful offshoot of Gilliman's line, had boarded the Echo as the Claws fought in desperate tight conflicts. The cause for the apothecary Varial was endless, as Talos, Mercutian, Cyrion and Uzas held their junction. The Imperial Thin Bloods unleashed their rounds into them and then charged. The bleeding eye raptors led by Lucofrius had been scattered. Uzas took a round to his spine as he fell back, clanging his head against the walls and ringing it like a bell. Mercutian called him an idiot as he laid down heavy fire to cover Talos, the Soul Hunter pulling his wounded brother to safety. Talos looked back down the corridor, watching as a warrior draped in Imperial laurels and donning a look of triumphant purpose emerged. At least we will die to a hero, Cyrion laughed, as their doom approached. It was a repeat of the Covenant at Crythe, when the Blood Angels had swarmed them, battles across every level, from the slave black market quarters to the tech priest Deltrian's workshop. Talos had only led the warband for months, and now it was likely going to end. But what of Cyrion and Uzas? What of the Eldar? Tolemnian Sarelen, a champion of Genesis chapter, a name that had struck fear in the hearts to many of the enemies of the God Emperor of mankind. A duelist who had not lost in over 4 decades. First Claw watched his impeccable advance, showering his tower shield with rounds as he lifted his thunder hammer. Talos, Cyrion and Mercutian drew their blades, never wishing harder in their lives that Xarl was here. Tolemnian began a speech, but First Claw was already moving. Even Uzas sprung up, roaring death to the false emperor, blood for the 8th. First Claw slammed into his shield, sparks flying off the Imperial's boots as he was shoved back. Uzas fell down, another Imperial blade piercing his spine. The squad of Tolemnian were on them too. Cyrion rose first and gutted one Marine. Talos bucked the knee of another and sliced. They were Nostramans first. They were murderers first. Without honor, one by one they killed them like dogs, until only Tolemnian stood. The champion charged and slammed down Mercutian, the noble born unconscious at his feet. Talos felt his vision blur and his mind swim. The sickness, now, of all times to act up. Aurum was knocked from his grip. A kick to his chest and a backhand sent Talos flying against the walls. His chest armor was a smoking ruin of black coal. Cyrion and Uzas were put down as the champion of the Genesis chapter stood victorious. First Claw breathed through the blood in their lungs, preparing to meet their end, until a figure stood behind Tolemnian. They didn't engage at once. Xarl and Tolemnian. They stared at each other for several moments, each taking in the trophies and honor markings displayed across their rival's suit of armor. The Imperial began to speak of his fallen brothers, how they died with honor. Xarl gestured to First Claw. They will die as they lived. Running away. Xarl gripped the haft of Uzas' chain axe and the grip of Talos' Aurium in the other hand and charged. Sparks flew from the chain axe as it bit into the tower shield. Xarl caught more strikes from the thunder hammer, feeling the electrical concussive blows reverberate through his bones. The two champions hacked at each other, shearing off ceramite and trading goring blows. He wasn't going to win if this stayed a fair fight, and his options to cheat were getting thinner with each drop of blood that ran from his body. The bastard's armor was too thick, and one more hammer fall would keep him down long enough for Talemnian to finish it. The Genesis Space Marine drew enough breath. Speaking admonishment, Xarl chose that moment to headbutt him. A life of bloodshed and battle meant Xarl was no stranger to pain, but pounding his bare forehead against the riveted, dense helm of an Adeptus Astartes company champion immediately ranked as one of the most agonizing moments of his existence. Talemnian's head snapped back, but Xarl wouldn't let him go. He leaned closer, around the buzzing weapons, and powered his head against the Space Marine's faceplate a second time, then a third. The impact made the corridor echo like a forge, and his nose gave away with a sickening snap on the fourth. On the fifth, something cracked in the front of his skull. Two more followed it. He was breaking his own face apart, and the feeling was both indescribable and painful beyond words. Blood sheeted into his eyes. He could no longer see, but he could feel Talemnian's muscles loosening, and could hear the gargling of a throat injury. He spat then, a stingy goblet of blood-diluting acidic saliva, and splashed it against Talemnian's eye lens, hissing its way into the flesh beneath. An eighth headbutt was enough to send them both reeling. Talemnian stumbling back against the wall, Xarl losing his balance and collapsing to his knees for several heartbeats. He sensed the shadow rising above him, and heard the tense growl of wounded power armor. He knew the Genesis Marine was raising the hammer high. Its distinctive thrum was unmistakable. Xarl's fingers closed around the hilt of Talos' energized sword, and with a scream of effort he rammed it upwards. It bit deep. Xarl didn't hesitate. He started carving as soon as it sank in. His clumsy, brutal hacksaw tore through armor, flesh and bone with equal relish. Gore rained onto him as he rose, cutting the champion's head from his shoulders. First claw rose as Xarl dropped Orium. He staggered against the wall as he placed his helmet back on. Not even since the Great Crusade or Heresy had they ever seen a duel like that. As they stood on shaky legs, they offered Xarl the Thunder Hammer that he had rightfully earned. "My brother," Xarl wheezed, "I regret arguing with you before. It is no sin to wish for a life with meaning, or a way to win this war." "Later," Talos said, his mind still thinking of the battle raging within the ship. "Yes," Xarl replied, "later." Xarl took a single step closer. His head rolled forward in a slow motion, and then his body followed, collapsing to the ground. He fell into Talos' arms, utterly limp, his armor broadcasting the tuneless whine of a flatline. Xarl died in Talos' arms. He wouldn't let them touch the body. Talos dragged it to the command throne. Even Variel would not touch him, even for gene seed extraction. The rest of First Claw told him to leave the body. They would do the same for all of them, but Talos refused. The battle's tide was turning in the decks. The Imperials would soon be dead, but that was not enough. They chased the Astartes vessel down, enacting the Vox screen they had used upon the Ganges station to prevent escape. Cyclonic torpedoes eviscerated the small moon the Astartes vessel had tried to hide behind, the debris smashing what remained of the Genesis chapter forces. Xarl was dead. Mercutian could hardly believe it. Cyrion chuckled, whether in disbelief or amusement only he knew. The repeated attempts to tell Uzas of an event he had took part in failed. Variel seemed to simply absorb the information. Once again his cold unblinking eyes betraying no emotion. Talos stood above Xarl's body in a private chamber. He alone would do this. He alone would touch his brother's body for the extraction of gene seed. Talos drew a gladius, feeling it weight in his hand. He had lost his Narcuthian gauntlet decades ago, and would not borrow Variel's. He smashed the pommel upon Xarl's exposed sternum. taking even him a few swings as the cracks echoed within the chamber. He curled his fingers around the ribcage and tore it open, his hands covered in his brother's blood. He turned Xarl's face to the side, perhaps to avoid judgment. A breath escaped the dead lungs and Talos froze. Even after all he had seen and done, he felt very human in this moment. The gene seed was ripped out. The work was half done. Talos knelt beside the mangled corpse of the man he had known longer than anyone in this universe. "Brother," he said, "a hero's burial awaits." He grabbed a flamer and triggered the ignition. Promethean flame lighted the chamber in a warm haze as the flames enveloped Xarl's body. Talos watched the flames dance as he thought of all they had been through. The streets of Nostramo, the tutoring sessions, their first murders, the gang fights, the elevation to Astartes, the Great Crusade, the day Talos' mother had died, to the walls of Terra itself. If there was a hell, Xarl was there, and soon he would join him. They weren't friends. They didn't even like each other, but they trusted each other. They were brothers. How rare for a Nostraman to know trust and brotherhood. Xarl had been his champion. He knew it. He would have been dead many times over if not for the renowned duelist by his side. It kept him alive in the war, from the other claws and even the exalted. How could he do this? How could he just die and leave him like this? Octavia and Septimus entered the chamber. Talos remembered his orders for them to stay separate, but right now he didn't care. "I'm sorry about Xarl," she said. "By your Legion standards, he was a good man." Talos snorted. Yes, a good man. The snort became a chuckle. A good man. A heretic. A traitor. A murderer. A fool. My brother, the so-called good man. The idea was so absurd it made Talos burst into a laughter so genuine he wept, the tears of grief flowing as he mourned the good man, Xarl of First Claw. Variol landed a blow into the face of Talos. Within the Apothecarian, First Claw, Third Claw and even the wounded drew their weapons upon the Flayer as he stared at Talos, his unblinking eyes holding Talos' own. "Why are we here, Talos? Why do you still wish to finish Tsagulsa? What in your visions has brought the warband here? Not knowing wasn't good enough. Ignore the visions, use your mind, think." Talos told the others to be at peace as he rose. "Thank you," he told Variol. He needed that. The Flayer apologized. Ever the polite sociopath, Variol was right. The ongoing raid on Tsagulsa had to mean something. Was it not he who had been ranting about purpose to the others? Had he not proudly stated that it was not enough to just survive, that they had to fight the war? Talos followed Variol into a private chamber. The balloon veins now visible beneath Talos' skin were concerning. Despite his body seemingly now failing, the look in Talos' eyes was filled with purpose. Tsagulsa would be the opening for what Xarl had known was coming. The very movement all could see for so long, but the Prophet himself. The true reason the Exalted feared Talos. The rebirth of the 8th Legion. Sevatar. He was the only one who could have kept the Legion together after the death of Kurz. But the old 8th was dead, so a new one would have to rise in its place, and one founded by the Prophet, the Soul Hunter, an inheritor to the will of Kurz, a beacon for the old generation and the new ones, bred and trained under the ideology of Talos Valcoran, the one who still held belief in the ways of the Night Haunter, bringing fear and punishment to this tyrant Imperium, justice for all they had suffered. Talos would become the very thing Abaddon had tried to foster. But he was dying. Variol told him that his gene seed had evolved, activated to its full potential. Perhaps in the right body, the visions would not be paralyzing, not a raving rant, but a controlled weapon. Talos knew he would not live to see it. But there was one last thing he would do. He would create the foundations for the generations to come. He would create one final act, one rallying point, because death was nothing compared to vindication. Tsagulsa's population, the humans who had hidden within their hives, were dragged out from their safety. Space Marines in midnight clad began to pile the bodies high. Some were doing their job, but most were enjoying it, as they skinned thousands alive and threw the bodies and skin into separate piles. The old Arch-Regent had been a brave man, refusing to comply with Talos, but it made no difference as he screamed like the others. The Imperium would see this world. They would see the devastation and weep. Talos saw each of the claws running rampant, clearly drunk on their own power. He saw what they were, even looking at Cyrion, clearly drinking in the human's fear with the frenzy of an addict. Uzas couldn't even form a cohesive sentence as he hunted down prey, his moments of clarity clearly few and far between. Talos saw them just as Kerr saw them. No wonder their father didn't care what happened to them after his death, but they could still be useful in building the future. The Psykers of the planet were gathered, all of the Psykers, from those in the Ashapathic choirs to the mutants and slum dwellers. Octavia entered the chamber that they were being kept in and immediately retched. The smell was a wave of putrefaction and death, draped in a rot so potent it stuck to the very back of her throat. She saw Talos, his arms stained in blood, arms deep within the living body of a Psyker. He'd almost finished the painstaking work of elevating their suffering to the limit of human experience. She tried to talk to him. What was the plan? Why do all of this? She didn't understand. She was just human. Talos was an Astraman. He'd only known kindness from his mother, a memory lost in the elevation to Astartes. He was 8th Legion, a Night Lord. If she knew what he had even done in the Emperor's name, she would have screamed. He wasn't afraid of death. This wasn't some grand last stand. This was about vindication. The barely functional human husks, the tortured souls whose power connected them by the warp, faced the death knell. Talos grabbed Octavia to show them the Navigator's eye. Octavia took off the bandana, allowing each victim to gaze into the abyss. Some died instantly. Some screamed. Some even detonated in a shower of gore. One by one, over 4 hours, Octavia killed them. By over a dozen in, she lost consciousness due to the strain. By the end, Talos held her upright and aimed the eye himself, killing the last of the mutilated Psykers, with Octavia barely breathing. A psychic scream. A wave of such misery and pain ballooned like an explosion. The backlash killing Ashapathic choirs, navigators and Psykers in over 100 worlds. The Song of Madness, an evolution of the scream used at the Ganji Station raid. The consequences would be apocalyptic. Entire sectors cut off and in ruin. A master stroke of 8th Legion pain. This was how they would win the war. Talos sat alone in his chambers, thinking. Still, when he closed his eyes, he saw the visions of the Eldar. Why did they haunt his visions? Like some great doom. They had attacked at the time of the Primarch's death. Something the Legion had never understood. Some visions never came true, though those were rare. He hoped that for Cyrion's death, sometimes only small details changed. Seeing that monster, that Eldar witch, with a howling face mask, standing over the corpses of First Claw on Tsagulsa, still haunted him, but he had to put it aside. The Song of Madness would bring Imperial retaliation. It was a siren, a call. A call. One not just the Imperium could hear. A sickening feeling washed over Talos. The Eldar, they would hear it too. Talos rushed to the throne room. A warning signal blared out as Talos ordered immediate jump to the warp. The alarms were ringing, and the Eldar were here. A storm in flesh, with a rain of blades, she who stalks the void, the storm of silence. 2 weeks of running, jump after jump. Talos hadn't even slept before they finally had 4 hours of peace. A moment Talos thought he could rest when he was called to the tech priest Deltrian's quarters. Cyrion told Talos a truth he had kept hidden, of what he had seen months before when the Covenant had evacuated to the Echo of Damnation. Refugees had come aboard, bearing marines, serfs, relics, and the mangled dreadnought of Malcharion the War Sage. The war on Crythe had been the glorious end of the half-dead captain of the 10th, one he had deserved, beating down the mirrored red dreadnought of the Blood Angel, the very one he had put in that sarcophagus 10,000 years before. But Deltrian had denied that wish. The tech priest, too lost in his reverence, had repaired and kept the War Sage alive. Talos found it strange, finding Uzas within the chamber. His red gauntleted brother told him it calmed his mind to be here. He didn't know what to make of that. Talos spoke viciously to Deltrian. The tech priest matched his height. His bionics and tubes grafted into his body reflected the mechanical and cold mind within. How could Deltrian understand the concept of brotherhood? Malcharion was more than just a man. He was a symbol, a sacred relic of the Legion in his own right. And in the tech priest's attempts to perform the reawakening rites, the War Sage is seen to be driven mad. Talos wanted no one to know. Let the War Sage have his legacy. He raised Orum's edge as Deltrian screamed. Talos aimed for the power unit and swung, only for the blade to hit the disruptive field. Talos, Deltrian, and Uzas flew back. It was done, until a voice, deep and metallic, coherent and loud, began to speak. Once again, combat had brought Malcharion into unlife, and a lot had happened since Crythe. The entire warband assembled. Talos, Variel, Cyrion, Uzas, Mercutian, Lucofrius. All the claws gathered as their leaders spoke with Malcharion in his dreadnought sarcophagus. The tale took 7 hours to tell. Malcharion told the Soul Hunter he had done well. He had already achieved more than Vandred ever had. The words of praise reverberated within Talos. But now the Eldar had come. More were arriving day by day, and they were hiding within an asteroid field near Tsagulsa, hoping the Xenos did not spot them. Talos made a plan. To fight in the void they would die instantly. He never possessed Vandred's talent for void warfare, but even he would not win against this amassing armada. Talos showed a hololithic display to all of the 8th. Death was nothing compared to vindication, but they would not die so easily. The display showed the old fortress, the Legion's once second home, the place where their father had died. 10,000 years had rotted it down to nothing, but beneath its catacombs were still intact. They would fight the Legion's way. They were the sons of a gang world. Murder in tight quarters was second nature. They would bleed the Eldar for every step they took, and they would be the perfect distraction. Talos entered Variel's chambers, and Talos told him to prepare. Prepare the gene seed banks and serf aspirants. Octavia, Septimus, and the Legion's relics too. Deltrian's own small vessel would be leaving under the cover of the asteroids, and Talos wanted Variel to go too. Variel protested immediately. No. I wear the winged skull of Nostromo on my pauldrons. I will die in that worthless world too if I must. But Talos told him no. He was a better apothecary than he ever was, and he would ensure the future of the 8th. Variel resigned himself. Talos knew his gene line didn't matter. Variel was a Night Lord by bond, and that's why he trusted him to live. Variel looked at Talos one last time, telling him he had an annoying habit of interrupting people and talking over them. Talos almost smiled, a character flaw he was sure to work on in the limitless time he had left. The rampart was closing. Septimus turned from Octavia and his child that she carried within. He looked to the master he had served for years, a monster he had always been afraid of, but yet even now he felt loyalty. He caught himself waving as Talos stared back. Humans, Talos thought. Emotions make them do strange things. Not only hours before, he formally released Septimus and Octavia from his service. Why did he do that? Perhaps he was more human than he cared to admit. The echo of Damnation one last time roared into battle. Screaming arcs of beautiful plasma streaked towards the swift Eldar ships. Some fell, but the host was closing in, raining piercing strikes that began to rock the ship. The drop pods fell from the burning wreck as the echo began to break in half. Varial, Deltrian, Septimus and Octavia watched the echo break, listening to the Xenos comms. Varial narrated the battle as it played out, with his usual monotone and cold voice, translating the Eldar until he froze. The Flayer began to listen intently. His time under the Blackheart had gifted him even Xenos slaves to torture and interrogate, a language skill that now changed everything. The Eldar, their chatter spoke not of some raid or territorial skirmish. This attack was a surgical strike. Craftworld Uthway. They spoke of prophecy, of a prophet of the 8th Legion who would reunite the scattered sons of Kurz and bring doom upon their home. They were here for the Soul Hunter. Talos' abilities, the visions, as Varial had told even the prophet himself, in the right body his gene seed would be incredible. His power could be reliable. The Eldar were going to kill Talos and his gene seed. This changed everything. The evacuation ship turned around and made a suicidal run to Tsagulsa. It was just like Nostromo all over again. The sons of that lightless hellscape were comfortable in this dark. The echo of Damnation imploded as Talos and First Claw entered the catacombs. The last gift was present with them in the drop pod, a prize stolen from the salamanders they had slain months before. With the Aquilas ritually broken, First Claw no longer stood in midnight clad, but Terminator patterned armor. Mercutian jested that he always wanted to headbutt someone to death, just as he had seen the Atramentar do during the Great Crusade. The heavy footfalls echoed in the winding tunnels. As Talos heard the Vox channels bloom with life, Talos heard the other claws laughing, bathing in Eldar slaughter as they imploded the Xenos filth. It was a better end than any 8th Legionary deserved, as they began to fall one by one. But it irritated Talos for how pointless this was. The battle with the Xenos had no meaning. Their vengeance was with the Imperium. Malcharian in his dreadnought chassis was resigned to the larger tunnels, and the Xenos weaved under his tread, as a battle resembling fly-swatting soaked the walls and floor with blood. Lucofrius and his twisted raptors launched from the crypts, unleashing in small ambushes, raking their claws and consuming the Eldar flesh. Some still alive as the raptor cult took their fill. First Claw had never worn Terminator plate before. It felt heavy, and the respect for their Atramentar brothers deepened. Talos bade them halt as enemies approached. He felt the enemy shuriken bounce off his plate as he fired his rotary cannon. The noise and power would have rocked him without the plate. As a stream of bolter rounds illuminated the corridor, the Xenos were mowed down within an instant. Again, First Claw were impressed and relished in this new power. Lucofrius' voice came over the Vox. It rasped with pain. The bleeding eye raptors were all dead, and he had seen her. An Eldar witch, the monster that was leading this hunt. The chatter grew over the hours, the claws slowly dying, speaking of one they called the Void Stalker. First Claw reunited with Third Claw deep within the catacombs, and almost immediately they were attacked. A more elite foe presented itself, and Talos saw how these Eldar were different, moving with a grace far beyond human potential. They sent howling screams towards the sons of Kurz that distorted as their blades bit deep. Uzas and Mercutian ripped them apart as Cyrion smashed one into the wall with a sickening crunch. First Claw fired until their guns ran dry. The extra protection had served them well, but the Eldar was sending more and more elite warriors, ones they could barely follow. They moved back, aiming to discard their heavy Terminator plate. They needed speed for their next engagements. Howling banshees launched at them once again, the screams vibrating Talos' armor, until he opened his own helmet's grill. Just as he had above Crythe, Talos inflated his 3 lungs and unleashed a scream. Eldar eye lenses cracked, organs burst, and all of them staggered as the rest of the Night Lords joined their scream to Talos's. Stunned and weakened, they quickly cut them all down. Another respite in the pitch black was earned, until they heard the footsteps. Talos felt his heart race, and his senses rose to full alert. He recited the words he had uttered in the visions for years. A storm in flesh, with a rain of blades, she who stalks the void. The storm of silence. She was like a howling banshee but greater. Jane Zar. The witch moved at such speed Talos heard the ring of flat line in his ears, as Third Claw were butchered upon her spear. The vision, the doom he had foreseen, the butcher of his brothers was here. Bolter rounds flew around the cramped chamber, not even able to catch the blur that danced between them, but just as quickly she melted into the shadows. There was only one option for an 8th legionary when facing a superior foe: run. First Claw made its way back towards the surface, acutely aware they were being hunted, not enjoying the experience for the first time on the other end. A call from Varial came through the Vox, to Talos' surprise, speaking of how the game had changed. They were here for him, the prophet who would unite the 8th, but he had no time to process it. Mercutian began to limp, a wound he had taken earlier in his leg, and the pain was spreading to his spine. He told them to leave him. "We didn't come down here to win," Uzas said, with such clarity that once again Talos looked at his brother in surprise. Spotting a wound on his head, and seeing that the blood-raving lunatic he had known for decades had had some sense knocked into him. "Let's end this," said Cyrion. "I was bored of being alive anyway." Talos looked to First Claw. Xarl wasn't here, but he would happily die beside these men. 2 hours of silence meant nothing to the danger they were still in, but the pace was slowing. Mercutian's breath was ragged. He didn't have much longer. He clung to his prized heavy bolter and told them to leave now. Here he would make his stand. Talos told him to leave his precious weapon. The game had changed. Varial had told them. Mercutian asked Talos if he believed it, that he would live on, that he would unite the Legion. Talos didn't know deep down what he believed, only that there was a chance. "If that is true," Mercutian responded, "then what visions had he seen after this fight?" "None," Talos replied. The Howling Witch was on them again. Mercutian shoved Talos off and told them to run. "Prey sight," the noble-born Nostraman screamed as he fired unheeded into the approaching shadow. But he would record no more deeds and names of his lost brothers, as the spear plunged through Mercutian and out of his back. He hung fetal upon the weapon as the alien monster whispered sleep in his failing consciousness. Mercutian moved faster than he ever had before, drawing his gladius and ramming it through her shin. The superior being cried out in pain as the Night Lord, recorder of his brother's deeds, Mercutian of First Claw, let out his last breath. First Claw became separated as they approached the surface. Talos looked to the dark skies, hearing flashes of thunder rumble. A feeling of nostalgia washed over him. He had seen this before. He looked to the entrance of another tunnel. He saw the prone form of Cyrion with Uzas leering above him, chain axe raised. Here, the vision he had seen for years, Uzas would kill Cyrion. Here, Talos sprinted to them and rammed Orm through Uzas's chest. My brother, Uzas said through the blood. I trusted you, Talos said with clenched teeth. I argued again and again and again to spare your life. I swore to the others you were still inside there somewhere. Somehow. Still a shred of nobility waiting to be reborn. You are the foulest, basest, most treacherous creature to wear the winged skull of Nostromo. I should have killed you years ago. The body of Uzas fell to the ground. For a brief second, Cyrion's face was contorted by guilt, only to vanish, telling Talos the mad dog had simply attacked him from behind. Talos voxed for any survivors, but none answered. Perhaps even the war sage Malcharian was dead too. Through the pouring rain, a new figure approached. Variel had come. Septimus and Octavia were waiting inside the ship. They could finally leave. Talos took one step on the ship rampart and stopped. It's not me, he said. Variel paused. It's not me. I don't think any prophet can unite the 8th Legion. I couldn't even unite one claw. Talos thought to his father's last words to him, about how the Primarch hated the Legion and his sons. He would be vindicated in death, and he didn't care what happened to them once he was gone. Talos the hero. That was how it started. Born on a miserable world, and to escape it he left his only family, his mother. The escape was supposed to be freedom, but it was only war. He threw himself into a new purpose. Justice. The Night Haunter's justice. But that failed too. He had lived a life of torture, death, scavenging and genetic degeneration. Even now the pain was with him. And the only time he ever dared to find purpose again, it had led to this. It is not enough. That rousing speech felt so hollow, because in truth it was a lie. An 8th Legion prophet will unite the Legion. How could that be him? In truth he felt the same as their father. He hated them. All of the Night Lords. It's not me. Take my gene seed upon death, he told Variel. The only thing I want is to kill that alien witch. Blood burst from Variel, and Talos finally saw that face contort with emotion. As a black-bladed tip gored the flayer, it pulled out and cleaved his legs. Talos moved first. He raised Aurum and met her next strike. Jane Xarl was quick, but didn't anticipate the cracking kick to her faceplate. He grinned at her, telling her that was satisfying. Soul Hunter, she hissed. He'd never told anyone how much he despised that name. Cyrion moved in too, as the demigod Xenos weaved around them. They were fast, centuries of war-honed skill, yet it was not enough. As she cleaved through him, Lucofrius, the last raptor, tried to slice her with his claws, but the spear impaled him, like the successful kill of a mere animal. Talos struck again and again, managing to slice her right arm at the elbow. The rain was splashing around the two as they danced the rhythm of death on this crying world. Aurum was knocked from his grip, and a kick slammed him to his knees. He tried to activate Prey Sight, and then Aurum's golden tip was rammed through his chestplate. She had killed him on his own sword. The witch drew it out and snapped the ancient weapon across her knee. Through only one working eye, Talos stared up at the Void Stalker. He wheezed through barely functioning lungs as his vision blurred. Talos rose slowly as the alien spoke. So dies the Hunter of Souls. The vision and reality overlaid before him. In my dreams you still had your helm on, he said. Fate is fluid, Hunter of Souls, she replied. And so it was. So many details were different, but the outcomes were all the same. Do not be ashamed, human, said Jane Xarl. Every human dies. Valas Morovi, he uttered through a broken jaw. First claw. The alien spoke in the human Gothic tongue. The disgust was evident on her face for using such a primitive language. They were your brothers. You call out to the dead in hopes they will save you. A thrumming sound began to build up. An 8th Legion gunship rose up and fired upon the alien. The creature darted into the shadows faster than even Astarte's eyes could see. "Master!" A voice blared from the ship. Talos looked up, and through his only eye he saw loyal Septimus and Octavia. Talos screamed that they are dismissed from his service for the 2nd time. Leave. Flee this accursed world. Run far. If Variel survives, he will come for the child. Talos wasn't leaving, for she had killed his brothers. With his shattered ribs, failing vision and bleeding wounds, Talos stood and chased after his fate. Talos stumbled forward. He found Cyrion prone and spluttering blood. He removed his helm, seeing black eyes roll to the back of his head. Cyrion gripped his brother's wrist. "Uzas," he said. "I'm sorry, Uzas." Yet even now the shameful truth would die with him. It was he who was responsible for the killings within the Covenant. Their delicious fear and death blamed upon Uzas. It should have been Cyrion to bear the red gauntlets. He knew it. Uzas. The bastard was becoming more coherent. That was why Cyrion had tried to kill him. Why Talos had intervened. Perhaps it would have been justice had he died. But Uzas would die by a brother's hand. "Don't use my gene seed," Cyrion rasped. "I'm done with this war." Cyrion began to shiver in Talos' arms. He was choking on his blood. "I'm dying," he said. "Everyone else has escaped. The slaves escaped. So, how are you?" The last breath escaped Cyrion's lungs. Talos closed his eyes gently. He took the grenades from his brother's belt and set off. It didn't take long for the Eldar to return. Even in her injured and bloodied frame, Xarl rammed a black spear through the Night Lord's chest, and Talos offered no resistance. He took the embrace of death. He dropped the broken hilt of Aurum from his left hand, and then opened his right. He let the grenades immolate them both. Talos Valcoran, son of Nostramo, son of Conrad Kurz, 8th Legion, Night Lord, Prophet, Soul Hunter, First Claw, died. This is a small segment at the end where I just want to sum up everything that I have learnt about this character and my kind of overall feelings as having read all the material. I have found Talos Valcoran to be a very fascinating and interesting character, and I mean a big thank you to Aaron Dembski-Bowden for writing such a great trilogy of books. I first read the novels absolutely years ago, and it was something long before even the channel had started, and it blew my mind quite how much you could get immersed within a Warhammer story to this degree, and then to be so attached to so many characters who, in a way, I never liked, but I also love to read about. Talos is great because his journey is essentially the story of the reluctant protagonist. He doesn't want to believe in his own mythology. He is the soul hunter, he is the prophet of the 8th Legion, and much of his life and his own abilities mirror what his Primarch went through. He's essentially a sort of, as weird as it sounds, a more sane Conrad Kurz. And perhaps the way he sees the abilities of Kurz affect him, he's reluctant, and the visions are not for him a sort of boon or what could have been. As much as Xarl talks about it, they are things that make him convulse in pain. But the worst part of his abilities is the fact that everyone seeks to use it against him or to use it for their own benefits. He is chased by a doom, his inevitable death, and also with Abaddon, who seeks to sort of make him and remold him into this messianic, unifying figure which he has no interest in being. He doesn't like to be the slave of other peoples and other legions and other warriors. For a character who, in the timeline of Warhammer, he joins the Night Lord's Legion so late, and yet he clearly missed that massive wave where some of the early recruits sort of hold to the ideals of Conrad Kurz, such as Sevatar. He naively holds on to the Primarch's teachings, even though he is so far from what Conrad Kurz truly ever preached, and even in his most sane moments. I think when he speaks to the ghost of Reuven after he turned him into bones, he says, if only the Legion had stayed pure. And it's so ironic because he never was in that category. He's never pure himself. It's the only way to sort of get around the madness of their lifestyle and the madness of their unjust vengeance, because he has to hold on to something, otherwise he knows he's kind of a massive hypocrite. He definitely, as a character, what makes him very interesting is that he holds these contrary beliefs. He doesn't want to rule. He's kind of happy to be just First Claw, Apothecarian, Talos, and yet he criticizes and clashes with other characters such as Vandred, the Exalted, and, Abaddon. He clashes with them because he knows exactly how one should rule, supposedly. Interestingly enough, when he's in those positions to rule, he doesn't have some great success. He only has one glorious moment, and then it's all the end of his story. His speech where he says, "It is not enough," he wants to be like Kurz. He wants to relive those glory days, fight for something more than just the scavenging they've done for centuries. He wants his life to have meaning, but he also wants that vindication that, I am right, that Kurz in his madness sought in the end, because Talos doesn't have anything else. And many other characters are kind of happy to exist in this nomadic lifestyle. They don't seek rulership or anything. For Talos, it's just simply not good enough. I particularly loved his every single interaction with First Claw in the entire trilogy is fascinating, particularly with how every character almost his judgment. He is so judgmental of every character around him, and they kind of bring out a different piece of him. Xarl is the character who he is known longer than anybody in this universe. He doesn't really realize how important Xarl is. He just finds him as, I trust Xarl, but Xarl I've never liked him. Not at one point were they even friends. But he didn't realize how important Xarl was until he didn't have Xarl around. Like, he couldn't be Talos the Prophet without a Xarl who basically kept him alive the entire time. And they definitely sort of have each other's backs, which I really enjoy reading about. There's loyalty there. Despite them being Nostraman, they both grew up on that hellscape. They sort of will, even since childhood, they always had each other's backs. Cyrion is an interesting one simply because he's kind of like the runt of the litter. He's always the one who they all judge him for his corruption by Slanesh and how he can sense fear. They are creatures, they are warriors designed to inflict fear. They're meant to be Astartes, and Astartes know no fear, as the Empress says. But the fact that Cyrion can feel fear, they all just sort of despise him. But yet, when he sees that reoccurring vision where Uzas is essentially trying to murder Cyrion, he is intensely protective. It's not his dislike of Uzas. Many other Night Lords have probably murdered each other in the warband over many of the decades in their survival, but he sort of goes out of his way to protect Cyrion in some circumstances. Mercutian is as the sort of later addition to First Claw. I like the idea of the backstory of Nostromo being sort of hinted at here, where all Xarl and Talos, they both see Mercutian, who was a noble born of Nostromo, and he's someone who probably grew up in a much the son of a gang lord, much wealthier existence, and it sort of sets him apart. But then brings a sort of depth to the story, and especially when Octavia mentions how he records the deeds of their fallen brothers, it sort of gives Talos a slight sort of more of a link to him, because he's sort of he's a character looking for purpose, and the idea of other characters living lives being worthy of being recorded is something that probably sticks with him. Uzas, poor old Uzas. Uzas is character, it's just so well done in the books, because it's a mad dog of a character. He's the liability, he's the problem, but over the trilogy he's sort of getting better, and Talos is learning to somewhat put faith in him again after, right at the beginning of the books he just despises him, thinks he's a problem, and throughout the books he keeps getting his hopes up and then disappointed, and at the very end, even though it's not the real truth of Uzas, randomly attacking Cyrion, it's actually the other way around. It adds to that layer of tragedy that Talos would just never know, and even at the end when Uzas does die, he dies just thinking, I should never have trusted him in the first place, which is, oh man, it's so hard to read, but it's really well done. Varial's interesting just because it's an apothecarian like Talos himself, but it just goes to show you that Varial is an element added in. It just goes to show that Talos, in a way, is not that talented, which I thought was, at least that's the way I always read it. He's not the best apothecarian, he's not the best fighter, he is simply just someone who's had a mythology built around him. And when he finally kind of admits to Varial at the very end, he says, it's just not me. I'm not the great hero, I'm not this messiah, I'm not the prophet. Varial kind of sees it too. Talos has almost been enslaved and carried on by his own prowess as, the prophet of the Eighth, a favoured son of Kurz. That's what's carried him this far. Not someone who's, in each of the members of First Claw, has been talented in some degree or a good fighter. It's only been Xarl to show like that kind of level of contrast. And it was fascinating to have something where it shows like the ideology of the Night Lords is more important than them necessarily being Nostraman. Xarl is an outsider, but Talos probably trusts him more than anyone else other than Xarl in the group. When Talos finally becomes a leader, it's thrust upon him. It's because Vandrid obviously dies. He ultimately fails, and it's right that he does. And everything that when he spoke about, living a life of purpose, within a Night Lord's version of purpose, it's in him trying to make things better that his great doom comes about. Talos is, and Abaddon does it so well here, like, he's not the hero. He is in fact the villain, but this is the villain of so many other people's stories. He's very much just shown to be a monster. I think my favourite conversation is when he speaks to Octavia, when I was so happy I chose that one particularly to get that voice acted, because we see through Octavia that he is essentially stubborn, and that his stubbornness is a beholding to the teachings of Kurz. It's almost like a retreat into that mindset, and ultimately she rightly in her mind calls him out. He's an emotionally stunted child. The Astartes are basically like children who never grew up, and then they were turned into frightening warriors, and that's what makes them terrifying. It's especially well done in the third book as well, where I think in the first two he's almost built up to be an anti-hero, and then towards the very end we just get reminded, oh no, Talos is not a good person at all. We are really just shown he is essentially 8th Legion. He is the madness of what Kurz's ideology is in practice. He is it just shows you what it does to people. It is horrific what he particularly does to the Psykers in the last book. And I mean, just a massive bravo to Aaron Dembski-Bowden for creating. I really enjoyed this character, and I just love the entire overall, the building up of Talos, and then the bringing him back down, showing us what the reader and the listener, the truth is that he is a monster, and in a way he wasn't meant to be the hero, and he just wanted to let that all go in the end. He never desired it, and he just chose to have the death at First Claw. He wanted to die with his brothers, so in a way he kind of got what he really wanted in the end. Thank you so much for listening. If you did make it this far, please make sure to like and subscribe.